My family left me standing at a security checkpoint in Los Angeles with an empty carry-on bag and a digital boarding pass I had never seen before. I ended up sleeping on the cold floor beside a charging station, humiliated and completely alone, while they flew off to a luxury resort. But the next morning, a billionaire I had never met walked up to me with a sealed file belonging to my late father and whispered the words that changed my life. Their $4 million inheritance just got frozen. My name is Sarah. I am 29 years old, and I work as a corporate bookkeeper. Right now, I need you to imagine the sheer panic of standing at the front of a TSA security line at a massive international airport, frantically tearing through your bag while 50 angry travelers sigh loudly behind you. "Mom, wait!" I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the loud announcements echoing overhead. I stood on my tiptoes and watched my mother Brenda, my sister Chloe, and my brother-in-law Todd disappear down the terminal toward their first-class gate. They were walking fast. They did not look back, not even once. I dug my hands deeper into the side pockets of my canvas tote bag. My wallet was completely gone. My driver license, my credit cards, my cash. Every single piece of identification I owned was missing. Then the memory hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Todd had insisted on helping me repack my carry-on in the chaotic hotel lobby that morning. He said my bag looked too heavy for the overhead bin and generously offered to put my bulky wallet in his checked luggage. He promised he would hand it right back to me at the gate. The TSA agent looked at me with an impatient glare and asked for my boarding pass. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone as I pulled up the digital ticket Todd had forwarded to me an hour earlier. I swiped the screen and held it out to the scanner. A loud red error tone beeped. The agent frowned and looked at my screen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and annoyed. "This ticket has been canceled, and you are at the wrong terminal. This is a one-way flight to Omaha, Nebraska. Omaha." My brain scrambled to process the word. We were supposed to be going to Maui. This was our family grieving trip. My father had passed away just 1 month ago, and my mother had insisted we all needed a week at a luxury resort to heal. She said she was paying for everything. She said it was what Dad would have wanted. I stepped out of the security line, my face burning with humiliation, as the annoyed crowd surged past me. I dragged my luggage to a quiet corner near a trash can and dialed my mother's number. It went straight to voicemail. I dialed Chloe. Voicemail. I dialed Todd. Voicemail again. They had all turned their phones off, or they had blocked my number. Why Omaha? I had no friends in Omaha. I had no family there. I had never even been to the Midwest. It was a fake ticket bought and immediately canceled just to generate a digital barcode that would trick me into getting dropped off at the wrong terminal. They had planned this. The realization crawled up my spine like ice water. This was not a mistake. This was a calculated, deliberate setup to strand me. For years, I had been the reliable one, the boring, practical bookkeeper who handled all of my father's messy finances for free. I spent my evenings and weekends organizing his accounts, paying his medical bills, and managing the modest estate he left behind. Meanwhile, Chloe was the golden child. She got the lavish wedding, the down payment for her house, the constant praise. I accepted my role because I loved my father, and I thought my mother and sister loved me in their own flawed way. But standing there in the glaring fluorescent light of the airport, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Today was Tuesday. The final crucial probate hearing for my father's estate was happening right now back in our hometown of Seattle. As the named executor of his will, I had to be there to sign the final release forms. My mother had begged me to take this Hawaii trip, promising we would file a delay with the court. She said family bonding was more important than legal paperwork. She lied. They stranded me out of state penniless and without identification, so I would miss the court date. If the executor fails to appear without notice, the court can declare them unfit and appoint the next of kin. My mother. She was going to take control of the estate. I felt a sob rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I was completely trapped. I could not buy a new ticket without money. I could not get past security without an ID. My phone battery was at 12%. I sat down on the hard linoleum floor next to a charging station, pulling my knees to my chest. The bustling airport blurred around me as tears finally spilled over my eyelashes. I had sacrificed my time, my energy, and my youth to keep our family afloat, and they had discarded me the moment I became an obstacle. I plugged my dying phone into the outlet and rested my head against the cold wall. I felt so incredibly stupid. I thought about my dad. He always told me to trust my instincts to look at the numbers, because numbers never lie. I had ignored the numbers to trust my family, and this was my reward. The hours dragged by. The airport slowly emptied out as the late-night flights departed. The cleaning crews started running their floor polishers. I was exhausted, hungry, and entirely broken. I had accepted that I was going to sleep on the floor of an airport and wake up the next morning to find my father's entire estate legally signed away to the people who abandoned me. But the universe has a very strange way of balancing the scales. I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve and stared blankly at the ground. Then a pair of incredibly expensive Italian leather shoes stopped directly in front of my sneakers. My thumb hammered the redial button on my phone. First, I called my mother. The call connected for a split second before clicking straight to a cheerful automated voicemail. I hung up and dialed Chloe. Nothing. I tried Todd. The line rang once and went dead. They were rejecting my calls. They were sitting in their plush first-class seats, sipping pre-flight champagne and deliberately pressing the ignore button, while I stood stranded in the middle of the Los Angeles airport. The terminal spun around me. Hundreds of travelers dragged their roller bags past me, families laughed, and departure announcements echoed endlessly from the overhead speakers. I was completely invisible to all of them. I backed away from the security checkpoint, my breathing shallow and fast. I found a cold metal bench near a closed coffee kiosk and collapsed onto it. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Why Omaha? Why would Todd hand me a fake digital boarding pass to Nebraska just to get me dropped off at the wrong terminal? It did not make sense until I looked at the calendar screen on my phone. Tuesday, October 14th. The date hit me with the force of a freight train. The probate hearing. My father passed away exactly 32 days ago. He was a good, hard-working man, but his financial life had always been a sprawling, chaotic disaster. For the last 6 years, I spent every single weekend buried in his paperwork. I was the practical one, the corporate bookkeeper. I balanced his ledgers, negotiated with his creditors, and made sure his modest estate did not completely capsize. Chloe never offered to help. My mother, Brenda, claimed she was too overwhelmed with her country club charity committees to deal with something as tedious as numbers. So I did it. I did it for free because I loved my father, and I wanted to protect him. When he died, the lawyer revealed that I was named the sole executor of his will. Brenda was furious. She believed she was entitled to control everything, even though she could barely balance a standard checking account without overdrawing it. But I held firm to my father's wishes. Today was the final, mandatory probate hearing back in our hometown of Seattle. The judge needed my physical signature to officially finalize the estate transition and grant me executive authority. Brenda had begged me to take this sudden grieving trip to Los Angeles before we supposedly flew onward to Hawaii. She swore she had her lawyer file an emergency delay for the court date. She hugged me, cried on my shoulder, and told me we needed to step away from the stress and heal as a family. It was a lie, all of it. There was no delay filed with the court. I knew the law. If a named executor fails to appear at a mandatory probate hearing without notifying the judge, the court can declare them negligent and unfit to serve. The judge would then automatically appoint the next of kin to take control of the estate. My mother. She was going to seize absolute control of everything my father left behind, and she was doing it right this very minute. The sheer calculated cruelty of it paralyzed me. They did not just leave me behind by accident. They meticulously plotted to strand me out of state. Todd taking my wallet to put in his checked bag was not an act of kindness to lighten my load. It was a tactical move to strip me of my money and my identification, so I could not possibly buy a ticket back to Seattle in time. I was nothing but a hurdle to them. A minor inconvenience they needed to neutralize so they could get their hands on the money. I stared at my phone screen. The battery icon flashed a bright warning red. 9%. I had no cash. I had no credit cards. I had no driver license. I could not buy a flight. I could not rent a car. I could not even buy a bottle of water from a vending machine. I pulled up my banking app, desperate for some kind of solution. But my heart sank. Even if I transferred funds or used a digital wallet, airport security would never let me through a checkpoint without a valid physical ID. I was completely trapped. I dragged my empty canvas tote bag down the endless concourse, desperately searching for an electrical outlet. My legs felt like lead. The panic adrenaline was rapidly wearing off, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing exhaustion. I found a public charging station tucked into an alcove near a bank of restrooms. I sank down onto the hard linoleum floor, plugging in my charger with trembling fingers. 5%. I pulled my knees tight to my chest and buried my face in my arms. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be enough for them. I organized their taxes. I planned their anniversaries. I fixed every financial mess Todd and Chloe created. I believed that if I was useful enough, if I sacrificed enough of my own happiness, they would eventually love me the way they loved each other. But sitting on that dirty airport floor, I finally understood the bitter truth. You cannot earn the love of people who only see you as a tool. The moment the tool becomes an obstacle, they toss it in the garbage without a second thought. I closed my eyes as the tears finally came. Silent, hot tears of absolute defeat. I was stranded. I was deeply humiliated. I was going to lose everything my father had trusted me to protect, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. I listened to the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the distant, uncaring chatter of strangers feeling entirely alone in the world. Then the sound of footsteps approached. They were not the hurried, frantic shuffles of a traveler late for a flight. They were slow, deliberate, and incredibly confident. The footsteps stopped right in front of me. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and slowly looked up. A pair of impeccably shined, expensive Italian leather shoes stood inches from my sneakers. I slowly traced my gaze upward from the impeccably polished leather shoes. The man standing over me looked entirely out of place in a drab airport terminal in the middle of the night. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that commanded absolute authority, paired with a subtle platinum watch that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting. He was perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, with neatly combed silver hair and striking razor-sharp blue eyes. Those eyes were currently locked directly onto mine, filled with a mixture of intense calculation and surprising pity. "Sarah," he said, his voice deep and resonant. I flinched. My heart hammered against my ribs. In a massive, transient space filled with thousands of anonymous strangers, hearing my own name felt like a physical shock. I quickly wiped my damp cheeks, suddenly hyper-aware of my tear-stained face and the fact that I was sitting on a dirty linoleum floor clutching my knees. "Do I know you?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "Not personally," he replied, smoothing his suit jacket as he did something that completely defied logic. This man, who looked like he belonged on the cover of a financial magazine, gracefully lowered himself to the ground and sat cross-legged right next to me on the sticky airport floor. He rested a heavy leather briefcase on his lap. "My name is Richard Caldwell." The name echoed in my mind, ringing a distant, massive bell. Richard Caldwell was a titan in the commercial real estate world. He was the kind of billionaire developer whose name was plastered across the sides of towering downtown Seattle skyscrapers and luxury medical plazas. He was an absolute giant in the business sector. I had audited subsidiary accounts that occasionally interacted with his holding companies, but a man like him existed in a completely different stratosphere than a mid-level corporate bookkeeper like me. "Mr. Caldwell?" I stammered, completely bewildered. "What are you doing here? How do you even know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are because I knew your father," he said, his tone softening just a fraction. "Arthur was a good man, a brilliant man. And for the last 15 years, he was my silent business partner." The air vanished from my lungs. I stared at him, trying to comprehend the words he had just spoken. My father had been a hard-working man, but as far as I knew, his finances were always a complete and utter disaster. I had spent countless weekends of my adult life sitting at his kitchen table, painstakingly sorting through his disorganized piles of receipts and balancing his meager ledgers just to keep the collection agencies away. I thought I knew every single cent he had to his name. "That is impossible," I whispered, shaking my head. "My dad owned a modest supply company. He struggled to pay his property taxes. He did not have billionaire business partners. Richard did not argue. Instead, he unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was not a standard legal folder. It was wrapped tightly with heavy twine and stamped shut with a thick puddle of dark crimson wax. The wax bore an intricate crest. It looked archaic formal and deeply important. Arthur knew his wife was greedy. Richard explained quietly, holding the heavy package in his hands. He knew Brenda viewed him only as a checking account, and he knew she favored your sister Chloe above all else. Your father intentionally played the role of a disorganized, struggling business owner at home because it was the only way to protect his real assets from the vultures he lived with. But behind the scenes, Arthur possessed an incredibly sharp mind for commercial real estate. Richard held out the sealed envelope. "Take it," he urged. My hands trembled as I reached out. The envelope felt incredibly heavy, weighed down by dense stacks of paper. "When Arthur passed away last month, your mother stood in front of your entire family and claimed he left behind practically nothing." Richard continued, his voice hardening with disgust. "She told you he only had a modest life insurance policy. She claimed it was barely enough to cover his funeral expenses and clear his outstanding medical debts. She played the tragic, destitute widow perfectly, did she not?" I nodded, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. Brenda had put on a masterclass in suffering. She had sobbed at the funeral, leaning heavily on Todd and Chloe, loudly bemoaning how my father had left her with absolutely nothing but a mountain of bills. Out of pure guilt and a sense of duty, I had drained my own small savings account over the past 4 weeks just to pay for her groceries and cover the utility bills at the family house. I had been skipping lunches just to make sure she was taken care of. It was a complete fabrication. Richard stated, his blue eyes flashing with cold anger. "Your mother has known the truth for exactly 3 days. She was digging through Arthur's old files, looking for anything she could pawn, and she found a hidden safety deposit box key. That key led her to a copy of his private ledger." I looked down at the dark red wax seal resting in my lap, tracing the smooth surface with my thumb. "What is in this folder?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The truth about your father," Richard replied. "Arthur and I jointly owned a highly lucrative commercial trust. We purchased, developed, and leased premier medical facilities across the Pacific Northwest. I was the public face of the operation, but your father was the strategic mastermind behind our acquisitions. He owned 40% of the entire portfolio. My brain wired for numbers, and practical accounting struggled to calculate the magnitude of what he was saying. I looked at the billionaire sitting on the floor beside me. How much, I asked, the words catching in my throat. Richard held my gaze, his expression dead serious. "The liquid value of your father's share in the trust is exactly $4 million. $4 million. The number rang in my ears like a deafening siren. My father. The man whose checkbook I had balanced every Sunday. The man who drove a 12-year-old sedan and wore fraying sweaters was a multimillionaire. He had built an empire in total secrecy. I thought about the endless hours I spent sitting at our cramped dining room table drinking cheap instant coffee while squinting at his tax returns. All those moments were a carefully constructed shield. He had allowed me to see him as vulnerable, just to keep the sharks in our family completely unaware of the feast waiting in the deep water. "He left the entire trust exclusively to you, Sarah," Richard said, his voice cutting through my shock. "Every single penny. He named you the sole executor and the sole beneficiary. He explicitly wrote Brenda and Chloe out of the legal documents because he knew exactly what they would do. He knew they would blow a lifetime of hard work on vanity luxury cars and country club memberships. He wanted to reward the only person in his family who actually loved him for who he was." Tears spilled over my cheeks, dropping onto the stiff paper of the envelope. My dad had not been a chaotic mess. He had been a quiet genius, protecting my future. He had seen my sacrifices. He had actually seen me. The profound weight of his secret love wrapped around me like a warm blanket, but the comforting warmth of that realization was instantly obliterated by a horrific freezing dread. The timeline suddenly snapped into sharp focus. My mother had pushed so hard for this sudden grieving trip. She had insisted we fly out of state just 24 hours before the final court appointment. Todd had been so aggressively helpful with my luggage. The missing wallet. The canceled digital boarding pass to Omaha. The probate hearing, I gasped, my fingers digging into the heavy envelope as I stared at the billionaire sitting beside me. The hearing is happening right now in Seattle. My mother begged me to come to Los Angeles. Todd intentionally took my wallet. They stranded me here without an identity, so I would default as the executor. They did not just strand you to take control of a standard estate, Richard said quietly, the lines around his mouth deepening into a grim and incredibly dangerous scowl. They found out about the money. I sat frozen on the dirty linoleum, the reality of my family's betrayal pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. My own mother and sister were willing to leave me completely destitute in a strange city just to steal a $4 million legacy that was never meant for them. Richard watched my expression shatter as the pieces fell into place. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell me everything would be okay. Instead, he tapped the heavy manila envelope resting on my lap. The billionaire was not here to offer sympathy. He was here to wage a war. I asked him how Brenda could possibly access a private commercial trust if my father had explicitly named me the sole executor. The courts have rigorous verification processes. A grieving widow cannot simply walk into a bank and demand $4 million without a mountain of legal clearance. Richard leaned closer, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. Your mother is not walking into a bank, Sarah. She is walking into a courtroom, and she is not going in empty-handed. Todd works in wealth management, does he not? I nodded slowly. Todd was always bragging about his high-net-worth clients and his intimate knowledge of corporate asset transfers. He loved dropping financial jargon at family dinners to make himself sound crucial to the global economy. Richard explained the rest with ruthless clarity. Todd used his industry connections to draft a highly sophisticated, fraudulent addendum to your father's estate plan. They fabricated a document allegedly signed by Arthur just days before his sudden passing, naming Brenda as the primary trustee in the event of your absence. They carefully forged his signature. Then they booked you a fake flight, stole your identification, and left you stranded in a secondary terminal in Los Angeles. With you completely out of the picture, Brenda can stand before the judge today, play the role of the abandoned, heartbroken widow, and present the forged addendum. The sheer audacity of their plan made my stomach violently churn. They were going to tell a judge I had fled my responsibilities. They would paint me as a negligent, uncaring daughter who ran off on a tropical vacation while my family stayed behind to mourn. And with me missing from the mandatory probate hearing, the judge would have absolutely no reason to doubt them. The forged addendum would be stamped approved and executed before lunch, once the judge signs that order. Richard said, his tone deadly serious. Todd has a series of offshore accounts set up to instantly receive the wire transfers. They are planning to liquidate the entire $4 million trust the very second the gavel falls. They mapped this out perfectly. By the time you found a way to borrow money, secure a temporary ID from the state, and buy a bus ticket back to Seattle, the commercial accounts would be completely drained. The money would be gone, dispersed through dummy corporations completely beyond the reach of local jurisdictions. My breathing turned shallow and rapid. The massive airport terminal around me felt like it was closing in the air, growing suddenly thin and cold. I looked at the large digital clock hanging over the nearest departure gate. It was 11 in the morning on the West Coast. The Seattle courts were currently in session. The probate hearing was not a distant threat looming on the horizon. It was happening right now. At this exact moment, my mother was standing in a mahogany-paneled courtroom, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, feeding a judge a carefully constructed narrative about her tragic, difficult daughter. Chloe was probably holding her hand, acting the part of the supportive, devastated sister. And Todd was undoubtedly standing right beside them, wearing one of his expensive tailored suits, holding a leather briefcase full of forged documents that would effectively erase my father's true final wishes and rob me of my future. I grabbed the edges of the envelope, my knuckles turning white. "We have to call the courthouse," I said, my voice rising in a frantic pitch. "I need to borrow your phone, Richard. We have to call the bailiff. We have to alert the judge. If Todd initiates that wire transfer, my dad's entire legacy is gone. We are sitting here on the floor of an airport 1,000 miles away. We are completely out of time." I scrambled to stand up, my mind racing through a dozen impossible scenarios. I thought about screaming for airport security, demanding to use their emergency landline, begging anyone who would listen to help me stop the legal machinery grinding forward in Washington state. I was hyperventilating, completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of my family's betrayal and my own terrifying helplessness. Richard did not move. He remained seated on the dirty linoleum, perfectly composed, radiating an aura of absolute control. He reached out and placed a firm, steadying hand on my wrist. "Breathe, Sarah," he commanded softly. "How can I breathe?" I shot back, the tears threatening to spill over again. They are stealing everything right now. Todd is going to push a button and wipe out my father's entire life. My dad trusted me to protect his legacy, and I failed because I was stupid enough to trust my own mother. Richard slowly let go of my wrist. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an apex predator who had just locked the cage door on its prey. He calmly opened his leather briefcase, the silver clasps clicking sharply against the ambient noise of the terminal. He reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper stamped with a bright gold judicial seal. "Let Todd try to push that button," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "I am a silent partner, Sarah, but I am not a blind one." I flagged the unauthorized transfer requests the moment Todd initiated the preliminary paperwork yesterday afternoon. My legal team was waiting at the courthouse doors when they opened this morning. He handed me the stamped document. Their $4 million inheritance just got frozen. Now we go on the offensive. The piece of paper in my hand felt heavier than a brick. I stared at the gold judicial seal, the crisp legal typography, and the absolute finality of the injunction. The panic that had been suffocating me just moments ago vanished, replaced by a cold and sharp clarity. Richard Caldwell did not wait for me to process the magnitude of what he had just handed me. He simply stood up, brushed a speck of dust from his tailored trousers, and told me to follow him. We did not walk back toward the crowded commercial security lines. Instead, he led me through a series of restricted access doors, flashing a specialized credential to a silent airport official who ushered us down a private corridor. Within 10 minutes, I was stepping out of the chaotic and fluorescent nightmare of the public terminal and onto the sunlit concrete of a private tarmac. A sleek jet was waiting, its engines already emitting a low and powerful hum. A flight attendant in a crisp uniform greeted Richard by name and took my cheap canvas tote bag without a single hint of judgment. I stepped onto the aircraft, sinking into a plush leather seat that felt like a completely different universe from the sticky linoleum floor I had just been crying on. As the cabin door sealed shut and the jet began its smooth taxi down the runway, I wiped the last remaining trace of moisture from my cheeks. There would be no more weeping. My mother Brenda, my sister Chloe, and my brother-in-law Todd had orchestrated a devastating betrayal, assuming I would just collapse and accept my fate. They banked on my compliance. They expected me to be the weak and obedient scapegoat who would quietly surrender my father's legacy because I was too timid to fight back. But as the plane lifted off the ground, climbing swiftly over the Pacific Ocean, a profound psychological shift occurred within me. The scared and abandoned daughter was left completely behind on the tarmac. The senior corporate bookkeeper took her seat. Richard sat across from me at a polished mahogany table in the cabin, nursing a glass of sparkling water. He opened his laptop and seamlessly went to work, giving me the quiet space I needed to gather my thoughts. He had already provided the defensive shield by freezing the trust. Now I needed to build the offensive weapon. I asked him for the network password. He handed me a small card with the secure credentials, his blue eyes watching me with a silent and intense approval. I booted up my own laptop, the screen flickering to life. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For over 7 years, I had been the unpaid and unappreciated financial manager for my entire family. I was the one who filed their annual tax returns. I was the one who reconciled their chaotic bank statements. I was the one who logged into their accounts to fix the late payment penalties they continuously racked up. They viewed me as their personal and free administrative assistant. Because they considered me to be completely beneath them, they never once bothered to update their security protocols. They never changed their passwords. They never revoked my access to their shared cloud storage. They honestly believed I was too loyal, or perhaps too unimaginative, to ever use their own data against them. I connected to the secure airborne network and opened my primary accounting software. I took a deep and steadying breath, then typed in the master administrative password for the family cloud drive. The system did not even prompt me for two-factor authentication. My mother had disabled it 3 years ago because she found the text messages annoying. The progress bar spun for a fraction of a second before granting me total and unrestricted access to the central hub of their financial lives. Folders populated across my screen in neat and organized rows. Bank statements, credit card bills, mortgage documents, and personal tax files. I clicked into the master directory. My heart beat in a slow and steady rhythm as I navigated through the digital labyrinth I had helped them build. I had always approached these files with a strict sense of duty, looking only at what needed to be fixed or filed. I had respected their privacy completely, but today the gloves were off. I was not here to balance a checkbook or correct a minor overdraft. I was here to conduct a hostile forensic audit on my own flesh and blood. I opened a massive spreadsheet labeled with Todd's name. He always bragged about his elite wealth management skills and his highly successful independent consulting firm. He wore custom suits and drove European sports cars, parading around family dinners like a titan of industry. My mother treated his every word like absolute gospel, constantly comparing my modest salary to his supposed massive windfalls. As my eyes scanned the raw data pouring down the screen, a chilling realization washed over me. I cross-referenced the incoming revenue streams with the outgoing expense categories. I pulled up the encrypted banking records that Todd had uploaded just 2 weeks prior, likely preparing for his next tax evasion scheme. The numbers began to tell a story that completely contradicted the arrogant and wealthy facade my family presented to the world. I saw the hidden reality buried beneath layers of complex transfers and dummy vendor payments. They had always treated me as the family scapegoat, the quiet and boring girl who just crunched numbers in the background. But looking at the massive and glaring vulnerabilities in their shared drive, I realized something incredibly empowering. I was not just their scapegoat. I was their absolute blind spot. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and greed that they left the keys to their destruction resting right in the palm of my hand. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes tracking a series of massive and highly irregular wire transfers originating from Todd's business accounts. The deeper I dug into the ledgers, the more the true nature of their desperation came to light. The screen of my laptop glowed in the dim, pressurized cabin of the private jet. I focused my eyes on the master folder labeled with my brother-in-law's name. Todd always loved to boast about his elite portfolio at our mandatory Sunday dinners. He would swirl his expensive scotch, adjust his custom-tailored silk tie, and loudly lecture my quiet father about the sophisticated art of high-level wealth management. My mother, Brenda, and my sister, Chloe, would hang on his every word, treating him like a financial prodigy who had graciously elevated our family into the upper echelons of local high society. But as I opened his primary operating ledgers, the genius illusion evaporated into a terrifying digital nightmare. They had always mocked my profession, calling me a boring number cruncher who lacked vision. They forgot that a corporate bookkeeper spends her entire life hunting for misplaced decimals, tracking hidden assets, and reconciling complex accounts. It took me less than 15 minutes of scanning his spreadsheets to realize that Todd was not a highly successful consultant. He was a desperate, drowning criminal. I started pulling up his transaction histories, tracing the flow of money from his supposed elite clients. None of the incoming deposits matched standard billing invoices or legitimate investment returns. Instead, I found a tangled web of dummy vendor accounts and offshore shell companies. He was moving fresh client funds directly into his personal holding accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle, and then using new investments to pay off older demanding clients who wanted their returns. It was a classic, incredibly sloppy Ponzi scheme. But the real shock came when I discovered a hidden password-protected subfolder containing his true liabilities. I bypassed the weak security question in seconds. Todd had not just been skimming off the top of wealthy retiree portfolios. He had taken massive, heavily leveraged loans from aggressive private equity lenders. These were not standard bank loans with friendly grace periods and polite customer service representatives. These were shadow creditors who operated on the fringes of the law, the kind of people who demanded immediate repayment with astronomical interest rates. I highlighted the columns, grouped the outstanding balances, and ran the final sum. Todd was exactly $1.2 million in debt. My hands felt ice cold as I stared at the bright red negative numbers glaring back at me. He was completely underwater. The late notices buried in his archived inbox were explicit and highly threatening. The creditors were promising to seize his assets, drain his wife's accounts, and initiate federal litigation if their money was not wired by the end of the month. Todd was weeks, maybe days away from a total financial collapse and a guaranteed federal indictment for wire fraud. Suddenly, the entire horrifying setup at the airport snapped into razor-sharp focus. This was never just about my mother wanting a bigger slice of the pie after my father passed away. This was about sheer desperate survival. Chloe must have discovered the massive mountain of debt her husband was hiding. She must have run crying to our mother, absolutely terrified of losing her sprawling mansion, her luxury vehicles, and her coveted position within their wealthy social circle. Brenda, who valued her pristine country club reputation above absolutely everything else in this world, could never allow her golden child to be married to a convicted felon. A federal scandal of that magnitude would utterly destroy their social standing in Seattle. When my father died and left the $4 million commercial trust entirely in my hands, as the sole executor, they panicked. They knew I was an honest, meticulous accountant. They knew I would require total transparency before dispensing a single penny of my father's hard-earned legacy. I would have demanded tax returns, audited their debts, and uncovered Todd's federal crimes within an hour of opening their books. I was the one insurmountable roadblock standing between them and their salvation. So they made a choice. My mother, my own flesh and blood, decided to sacrifice her youngest daughter to save a criminal. They stranded me out of state, stole my identity, and plotted to forge a legal addendum so they could instantly access the trust. They desperately needed that $4 million to silently pay off the $1.2 million shadow debt, keep Todd out of a federal penitentiary, and use the remaining millions to maintain their pathetic illusion of extreme wealth. A profound, burning clarity washed over me. I was not sad anymore. I was angry. And an angry bookkeeper with unrestricted access to a cloud server is the most dangerous weapon in the corporate world. I did not hesitate. I began exporting every single file. I downloaded the forged client invoices. I copied the threatening emails from his private creditors. I secured the exact wire transfer routing numbers he had used to illegally funnel money out of his consulting firm. I compiled it all into a massive, heavily encrypted zip file on my desktop. This was the irrefutable proof of massive, federally illegal embezzlement. This was the absolute destruction of Todd and the entire gilded, rotting facade my mother had sacrificed me to protect. The download progress bar ticked steadily across my screen. 90%, 95%, 100%. Completed. I had them. I had everything I needed to lock him away for a decade. Just as I safely backed up the folder to my own private drive, the quiet hum of the jet cabin was violently broken by a sharp, urgent ringtone. Richard Caldwell reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the caller ID, and his calm, confident demeanor shifted instantly. His jaw tightened into a hard, rigid line. He tapped the screen and held the phone to his ear, listening intently to the rapid voice on the other end. I watched him, my pulse picking up speed. The sudden tension radiating from his broad shoulders told me something was terribly wrong. Richard did not speak for a long moment. He just nodded slowly, his striking blue eyes locking onto mine with a sudden fierce urgency. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and commanding. "Tell the team to hold the line," Richard ordered the person on the phone. "Do not let that judge sign anything until we walk through those doors." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the mahogany table. He leaned forward, the terrifying apex predator smile he wore at the airport completely gone. "We have a massive problem, Sarah," Richard said, his tone tight with impending conflict. "My legal team just intercepted a motion at the King County Courthouse. Brenda and Todd did not just roll over when they found out the trust was temporarily frozen. They hired one of the most ruthless estate litigators in Seattle. Their lawyer is standing in the judge's chambers right now, demanding an emergency judicial override to unfreeze the accounts. They are claiming you are experiencing a severe mental breakdown, that you voluntarily fled the state, and that they need immediate access to the funds to preserve the family business. If the judge grants that emergency motion, they can bypass our freeze and drain all $4 million before our plane even touches the runway." The descent into Seattle felt like plummeting straight into a battlefield. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched the familiar emerald canopy of the Pacific Northwest break through the thick and heavy gray clouds. The wheels of Richard Caldwell's private jet hit the tarmac with a jarring thud. Before the aircraft had even fully taxied to a halt, the cabin door was unsealing. There was absolutely no time for pleasantries or waiting for standard ground crew clearance. A sleek, black town car was idling right on the runway, its engine rumbling like a caged animal. Richard grabbed his leather briefcase, shot me a single look of sheer determination, and we moved. The drive into the downtown core was a chaotic blur of rain-slicked pavement and blaring horns. Richard told his driver to ignore the speed limits. We tore down Interstate 5, weaving through the notorious mid-morning traffic with the aggressive precision of an emergency vehicle. My heart hammered against my ribs with every sudden lane change and sharp turn. I clutched my canvas tote bag, guarding the encrypted flash drive containing Todd financial ruins so tightly that my hands physically cramped. We were racing against a ticking judicial clock, fighting a legal machine that my mother had deliberately weaponized to erase my entire existence. The imposing stone facade of the King County Courthouse finally loomed into view through the rain. It was a massive historic building that usually demanded quiet respect and careful reverence from anyone who walked through its towering doors. Today, it was just a concrete fortress I had to breach. We practically leaped out of the car before it came to a complete stop at the curb, the cold Washington drizzle instantly soaking my shoulders. We sprinted up the wide marble steps, dodging lingering paralegals and distracted pedestrians holding coffee cups. The security checkpoint inside the grand lobby felt agonizingly slow. I threw my bag onto the X-ray belt, hopping from one foot to the other as the uniformed guard casually scrutinized my lack of physical identification. My pulse roared in my ears. Every second that passed was another second Brenda and Todd had alone with the judge. Richard did not wait for the guard to finish his slow inspection. He stepped forward, flashed an elite corporate credential, spoke a few sharp, highly authoritative words to a security supervisor he clearly knew, and pushed me straight through the metal detectors. We hit the main elevators at a dead run. The digital numbers above the brass doors crawled upward to the 4th floor, openly mocking my absolute panic. My father's entire legacy was hanging by a literal thread held hostage by a woman who viewed family relationships as nothing more than a profitable transaction. The elevator chimed softly. The doors parted, and we rushed down the long, echoing corridor. The smell of old paper and floor polish filled the air, a stark contrast to the burning adrenaline pumping through my veins. We reached the heavy oak doors of probate courtroom number 4 just as a booming theatrical voice leaked out into the quiet hallway. I recognized that slimy, condescending tone immediately. It was Gregory Thorne, a notorious local attorney whose moral compass was as incredibly flexible as his exorbitant billing rates. I grabbed the brass handle, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped into the hushed mahogany-paneled chamber. The scene inside was perfectly staged like a grotesque theater production. My mother, Brenda, was sitting at the plaintiff table dressed in somber black, dabbing her completely dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Chloe sat closely beside her, patting her shoulder in a display of fabricated, daughterly devotion. Todd stood directly behind them, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and a deeply inappropriate, smug grin that made my stomach violently turn. Gregory Thorne was pacing slowly in front of the judge-elevated bench, holding up a thick stack of fabricated documents like they were the absolute gospel truth. "Your Honor," Gregory announced, his voice dripping with a sickening layer of fake sympathy. "It brings my clients absolutely no joy to present this emergency petition today. This is a family currently drowning in profound grief. But the facts of the matter are undeniably clear, and the estate cannot be left to rot." The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled back into a severe twist, peered down at him over her reading glasses. She looked completely unimpressed, but she was listening. "Sarah has completely abandoned her sworn duties," Gregory continued, raising his voice to ensure his dramatic words filled every corner of the room. "She voluntarily boarded a flight out of state this very morning, willfully fleeing her responsibilities during her family's darkest hour. We have the airline logs to prove she is not even in Washington state. Her deliberate absence today at this mandatory hearing is a clear and voluntary forfeiture of her executor rights. She has left this grieving widow completely paralyzed financially." I stood frozen by those back doors, listening to the sheer audacity of their lies. They had stolen my wallet. They had purchased the fake ticket. They had stranded me in Los Angeles. And now they were using my manufactured absence to paint me as a selfish, negligent villain who did not care about her own father. "We respectfully request that you invalidate Sarah's appointment immediately," Gregory concluded, placing his hands flat on the wooden table. "We ask you to grant full, unrestricted executive authority to her mother Brenda, a woman who is actually present, who deeply loved her husband, and who is ready to protect this estate from falling into total disarray." The courtroom was completely silent save for the sound of the rain lashing against the tall glass windows. The judge sighed softly, a sound of administrative fatigue. She reached toward the edge of her massive desk, her fingers wrapping around a heavy black pen. She pulled the final transfer order toward her, adjusting her glasses to read the signature line. At the plaintiff table, Brenda let out a soft, tragic sigh. She lowered her lace handkerchief, and I saw the corners of her mouth twitch upward into a triumphant, victorious smile. Todd subtly adjusted his expensive tie, already acting like a man who had just inherited millions. They thought they had won. They thought the money was theirs. They had absolutely no idea I was standing right behind them. "Your Honor, I have not abandoned my post, and I have certainly not forfeited my rights as the executor of this estate." My voice rang out across the quiet mahogany chamber, steady and clear. The effect was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying. Gregory Thorne, literally, dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wooden table. Todd spun around so fast he nearly knocked over his chair, the smug grin sliding right off his face to reveal pure, unfiltered panic. Chloe let out a tiny gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. But it was my mother whose reaction I will never forget. Brenda turned slowly, her eyes wide with sheer terror. She stared at me as if a ghost had just materialized in the back of the courtroom. Her meticulously crafted illusion of the helpless grieving widow shattered the second she realized her discarded daughter had somehow crawled out of the trap she set. I did not walk down the center aisle alone. The heavy oak doors swung open wider, and Richard Caldwell stepped into the room. He was flanked by 3 elite corporate litigators from one of the most ruthless law firms on the West Coast. They did not look like the sleazy local attorneys my mother hired. They moved with the cold, synchronized precision of a heavily armed military unit entering a combat zone. The judge lowered her pen, her sharp eyes darting from Brenda to me and finally landing on the billionaire developer. Mr. Caldwell, the judge, said, her tone instantly shifting from administrative boredom to absolute attention. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Richard did not say a word. He simply nodded to his lead counsel, a towering woman in a sharp charcoal suit. She strode confidently past Gregory Thorne, completely ignoring his outraged sputtering, and approached the bench. "Your Honor," the attorney announced, handing a thick, wax-sealed folder directly to the court clerk. "My client Sarah is the legally designated executor of her father's estate. She was deliberately stranded out of state this morning in a coordinated effort to prevent her appearance today. Furthermore, the addendum Mr. Thorne just presented to this court is a complete and total fabrication. We are filing an emergency injunction to immediately halt any and all transfers of assets." Gregory Thorne's face turned the color of spoiled milk. "I object," he shouted, waving his arms. "This is a baseless accusation. My clients provided a sworn document." The corporate attorney did not even look at him. She opened her leather binder and produced a crisp, verified stack of papers. She handed them to the judge. "What you are holding, Your Honor, is the original authentic trust agreement executed 5 years ago and secured in a private vault," the attorney stated firmly. "You will find the deceased true signature verified by 2 independent notaries and a senior bank official. If you compare it to the sudden addendum Mr. Thorne just offered, you will notice glaring discrepancies in the handwriting. We also have sworn affidavits from the hospital staff confirming the deceased lacked the physical motor skills to sign any legal documents on the date the fabricated addendum was supposedly created." The courtroom descended into a suffocating, terrifying silence. I watched the judge carefully slide her reading glasses down her nose. She placed the 2 documents side by side on her elevated desk. Her eyes flicked back and forth between the real signature and the sloppy forgery Todd had likely drafted in his home office. The transformation of the judge was a beautiful thing to witness. The subtle sympathy she had shown my mother evaporated. Her face hardened into a mask of pure judicial fury. She picked up the emergency transfer order Gregory Thorne had spent the last 20 minutes arguing for. She did not just set it aside. She ripped it in half right there on the bench. This court is issuing an immediate indefinite freeze on all accounts associated with this trust. The judge declared, her voice cracking like a whip. There will be absolutely no liquidations, no transfers, and no modifications of executive authority. Mr. Thorne, I highly suggest you advise your clients on the severe federal penalties for submitting forged legal documents to a probate court. We are adjourning until a full forensic investigation can be completed. The swift and brutal bang of the gavel echoed through the chamber. Todd looked like he was going to vomit. His pristine navy suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big as he slumped against the plaintiff table. He knew exactly what that gavel strike meant. His offshore accounts would remain completely empty. The shadow creditors he owed $1.2 million were going to come collecting, and he had absolutely nothing left to hold them off. Brenda scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking violently. Your Honor, please, there is a massive misunderstanding here, she pleaded, her voice cracking with genuine desperation. We are just trying to protect the family business. My daughter is confused. The judge pointed a stern finger directly at my mother. Do not speak another word in my courtroom, ma'am, she warned coldly. You are incredibly lucky I am not having you detained for fraud right this second. Get out. I stood near the heavy wooden doors and watched my family retreat. Chloe linked arms with Todd, whispering frantically in his ear, demanding to know what was going wrong. Brenda walked past me with her head down, refusing to make eye contact. The sheer arrogance they had paraded around with just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that they had finally lost control. Richard put a supportive hand on my shoulder as the courtroom cleared out. We won, he said quietly. The money is safe. They cannot touch a single dime. I looked down the hallway, watching Todd furiously dialing his phone, likely begging his private lenders for a few more days of grace. A cold, heavy realization settled into my bones. Richard was wrong. We had not won. We had only delayed them. Stopping the wire transfer today was nothing more than plugging a tiny leak in a dam that was about to explode. I knew my mother and I knew my brother-in-law. They were desperate cornered animals now. Todd's impending federal indictment and his massive underground debt meant they could not simply walk away and accept defeat. They would find another legal loophole. They would bribe another official. They would forge another document or find a way to illegally drain the equity out of the family estate just to keep themselves out of prison. Temporarily freezing the trust was simply not enough to stop them. If I wanted to protect my father's legacy and ensure they could never manipulate or threaten me again, I needed to completely dismantle their gilded facade from the inside out. I needed the final piece of the puzzle. I needed the undeniable proof of their long history of financial abuse, and I knew exactly where my father had hidden it. My family was currently heading to an upscale restaurant to regroup and panic over their failed scheme. The sprawling family estate in the suburbs would be completely empty for the next 3 hours. It was time to break into the lion den. The heavy black town car dropped me off 2 blocks away from the sprawling family estate in the affluent Seattle suburbs. The cold afternoon drizzle had finally stopped, leaving a heavy layer of mist clinging to the manicured lawns and towering evergreen trees. I pulled up the collar of my coat and walked briskly down the familiar sidewalk. My heart was beating with a steady and rhythmic intensity. I was no longer the timid and people-pleasing daughter returning to this house to beg for basic affection, or to wash the dishes after a dinner party. I was a corporate auditor stepping directly onto an active crime scene. Richard Caldwell had deployed his private security team to tail Todd right after our explosive confrontation at the courthouse. The update I received on my phone just minutes ago was almost too absurd to believe. Instead of rushing to a legal office to handle his impending federal indictment and the absolute freezing of his offshore accounts, Todd had driven Brenda and Chloe straight to a luxury European auto dealership across the water in Bellevue. He was playing a desperate and high-stakes game of psychological manipulation. Todd had somehow convinced my incredibly arrogant mother and my clueless sister that the judge freezing the $4 million trust was nothing more than a temporary clerical error. He assured them his elite legal team would have the massive funds released by Monday morning, and he urged them to go shopping for custom luxury vehicles to celebrate their imminent windfall. He needed them completely distracted by hand-stitched leather seats and expensive engine upgrades so they would not realize he was drowning in over $1 million of violent shadow debt. Their insatiable greed was their ultimate blind spot, and it provided me with a perfectly empty house to execute my plan. I slipped through the wrought iron side gate, navigating the slick stone path that led around to the back patio and the kitchen entrance. My hands did not shake as I retrieved my old brass key and slid it into the lock. The deadbolt clicked open with a heavy and satisfying thud. I stepped into the pristine and silent kitchen, immediately assaulted by the cloying scent of my mother and her expensive floral diffusers. The red security system panel on the wall blinked a warning light, demanding a code to prevent the alarms from triggering. I calmly typed in the 4-digit sequence my father had set over a decade ago. The red light shifted to a docile green. My mother cared immensely about the appearance of safety and prestige, but she was entirely too lazy to ever update the actual security protocols of her own home. The silence in the massive house was absolutely deafening. I walked past the grand living room, with its imported Italian furniture, and the long dining table where I had endured years of subtle insults and blatant disregard. I remembered all the holidays I had spent cooking and serving them while they mocked my career choices. The memories of their cruelty washed over me, but they did not drag me down or make me want to cry. They only sharpened my intense focus. Every single polished surface in this house was paid for by the sweat of a man they fundamentally despised and used. I moved swiftly down the carpeted hallway and stood before the heavy oak door of my father in his old study. This was the one room in the entire estate that Brenda absolutely hated. She considered it drab depressing and completely beneath her country club standards. She constantly complained about the cheap furniture and the overflowing stacks of paper leaving the room entirely to him. I gripped the brass handle and pushed the door open. The air inside the study felt entirely different from the rest of the house. It smelled faintly of old parchment, bitter black coffee, and the inexpensive aftershave my father had worn for 20 years. A sudden and sharp ache bloomed in my chest. I looked at the worn wooden desk, where we had spent countless Sunday afternoons working side by side. I remembered watching him carefully sort his receipts, acting overwhelmed by the simplest arithmetic, while secretly building a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire right under our noses. He had played the fool perfectly to protect his massive fortune from the greedy vultures living just down the hall, but I could not afford to let grief slow me down right now. My analytical bookkeeper brain kicked into high gear. If my father had successfully hidden a $4 million commercial trust and maintained a shadow partnership with a billionaire developer for over a decade, he would never leave the physical proof lying around in a standard filing cabinet. He knew my mother was highly prone to snooping when she wanted extra cash to fund her shopping habits. The evidence of Todd and his long history of financial abuse, the undeniable leverage I needed to completely destroy their fabricated lives, had to be secured somewhere completely impervious to the prying eyes of Brenda. I slowly surveyed the room, absorbing every single detail. I checked the sagging bookshelves, the dull brass lamps, and the cheap metal filing cabinets stacked in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. But then my eyes dropped to the floor. My father had a large and incredibly heavy leather armchair sitting directly behind his desk. It rested on top of a thick and faded Persian rug. Whenever my mother hired professional cleaning crews to scrub the house before one of her lavish dinner parties, my father would become strangely territorial about this specific room. He explicitly forbade anyone from moving that armchair or vacuuming beneath that specific rug. He claimed the heavy furniture would scratch the hardwood floors. As a teenager, I thought it was just the quirky behavior of an aging man who hated disruption. Today, I saw it for what it truly was. It was a calculated security measure designed to protect his most precious secrets. I walked around the desk and grabbed the armrests of the heavy leather chair. I braced my legs and shoved it hard toward the wall. The chair groaned loudly across the floorboards. I dropped to my knees and grabbed the frayed edge of the thick Persian rug, throwing it back to expose the dark hardwood underneath. At first glance, the wooden planks looked entirely normal and seamless. But as I ran my fingertips along the edges, feeling the subtle variations in the grain of the wood, I found what I was looking for. One of the floorboards had a slight and unnatural groove cut into the side. I pressed down firmly on the corner of the wood. A hidden mechanical latch clicked sharply in the silence of the room. The small wooden panel popped up, revealing a heavy steel plate and the cold numerical dial of a concealed floor safe embedded directly into the concrete foundation of the house. A massive surge of pure adrenaline shot through my veins. The metal dial was cold against my fingers. I did not need to search for a hidden combination written on a scrap of paper hidden in a drawer. I knew my father better than anyone else in the world. He would never use his own birthday, his wedding anniversary, or any predictable date that Brenda could easily guess. He would use the one date that actually meant something profound to him. He would use the date he was most proud of. I spun the dial to the left, stopping precisely on the month I graduated from college. I rotated it back to the right, landing perfectly on the exact day I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. I turned it to the left, one final time, aligning the hash mark with the year I earned my accounting degree. The heavy steel locking mechanism released with a deep and echoing clank. I grabbed the iron handle and pulled the vault door open, staring down into the darkness of the hidden compartment, absolutely ready to pull the pin on the grenade that would obliterate my family completely. The heavy steel door of the vault swung open with a smooth metallic glide. Inside the dark fireproof cavity lay the true inheritance my father had left behind. It was not stacks of cash gold bars or glossy stock certificates. It was a collection of worn leather-bound journals, neatly stacked beside a small silver digital voice recorder and a thick manila folder. I reached down into the cold safe and pulled the top journal from the stack. The leather was soft and supple, conditioned by years of my father holding it in his hands during late nights in this very room. I opened to the first page. The familiar, meticulous handwriting I had spent my entire life analyzing on tax forms and receipts filled the lined paper. But these were not ledgers or supply orders. These were his deepest, most private thoughts. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, surrounded by the quiet hum of the empty house, and began to read. The entries painted a vivid, agonizing picture of a man who was entirely awake to his own tragedy. My father knew absolutely everything. He documented Brenda and her endless manipulation, recording exactly how she slowly and systematically isolated him from his friends over the decades. He wrote about how she relentlessly belittled his ambitions while simultaneously demanding the luxurious fruits of his labor. He wrote about Chloe, detailing her aggressive entitlement and the painful realization that his golden child viewed him only as an automated teller machine to fund her vanity. He had not been a clueless, bumbling husband oblivious to their greed. He had been a hostage in his own home, carefully playing the part of a defeated man just to maintain a fragile peace and protect the real wealth he was quietly accumulating. The tears I had been fighting back all day finally broke free when I reached the entries about me. Pages upon pages were dedicated to my quiet sacrifices. He wrote about the countless weekends I spent balancing his fake books, describing the immense guilt he felt watching me skip social events, vacations, and personal milestones just to help him navigate his fabricated financial disasters. He called me his anchor in a house full of storms. He wrote that my absolute loyalty was the only pure thing left in his life. I had spent 28 years believing I was an invisible burden, a boring bookkeeper who could never measure up to the dazzling charm of my sister. But in the quiet sanctuary of his mind, my father saw me as his greatest pride. He explicitly stated that the $4 million trust was not just an inheritance. It was his apology. It was my freedom. I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve and picked up the small silver digital recorder resting at the bottom of the safe. I pressed the play button. The small speaker cracked to life with a faint hiss of static, and the deep, comforting sound of my father speaking filled the room. It felt like he was sitting right there beside me, in the old leather chair. He spoke clearly and deliberately. He stated his full legal name, the exact date of the recording, and his explicit intent to leave the entirety of his estate to me. But the recording did not stop there. The tone of his voice shifted, dropping its warmth and turning incredibly cold. He proceeded to outline a terrifying timeline of events I knew absolutely nothing about. 2 years ago, Todd had discovered a fraction of my father's hidden commercial assets. Instead of coming forward to the family, Todd tried to extort him. He threatened to expose the hidden wealth to Brenda and Chloe, knowing they would instantly demand access and drain it dry unless my father paid him a silent $250,000 to cover his shadow gambling debts. My father flatly refused. He recorded the extortion attempts, documented Todd's financial crimes, and locked the evidence away in this very safe, waiting for the day his greedy son-in-law would inevitably try to strike again. My father knew Todd was a criminal, and he had carefully gathered the exact ammunition I would need to defend myself when the time came. I was holding the literal key to a federal indictment. This recorder, combined with the journals and the folders of documentation, was the absolute silver bullet that would annihilate their fraudulent probate claims and send Todd straight to a federal penitentiary. I slipped the recorder and the thick leather journals into my canvas tote bag, zipping it shut with trembling fingers. The sheer magnitude of what I had just uncovered made my head spin. I was completely ready to walk out the front door, hail a cab, and hand this entire package over to Richard Caldwell's elite legal team. But before I could even push myself up from the floor, a sound shattered the quiet solitude of the house. The heavy front door chimed loudly as the deadbolt was violently thrown back. Loud, booming laughter echoed through the grand marble foyer. My heart leaped into my throat, blocking my airway. They were home. I heard the unmistakable sound of Chloe's expensive heels clicking rapidly across the entryway tiles. I heard Todd loudly boasting about the custom leather interior of a luxury import he could not actually afford to buy. Then came the sharp, distinct pop of a champagne cork, followed by Brenda triumphant shrill cheers. They had returned from their shopping spree entirely too early, drunk on the illusion of a victory they thought they had securely won at the courthouse. Their heavy footsteps were moving directly down the main hallway toward the study. They were coming to search his desk, looking for anything else they could liquidate. I had absolutely no time to close the heavy steel vault door. I had no time to pull the thick Persian rug back into place, and I certainly had no time to push the massive leather armchair back over the hidden compartment. I grabbed my canvas tote bag, scrambled desperately toward the large back window, and shoved the heavy glass pane upward, praying I could slip out into the misty afternoon before they caught me red-handed with the truth. The heavy sash window slid upward with a harsh scrape, just as the brass doorknob to the study began to rattle. I threw my canvas tote bag onto the wet grass outside and hoisted myself over the wooden sill. I dropped onto the damp lawn and instantly pressed my back against the cold brick exterior of the house. Inside the room, I heard my mother complain loudly about a sudden draft. I heard Todd in his heavy boots thudding across the hardwood floor, marching directly over the exact spot where the hidden safe lay completely exposed. I did not wait to hear if they noticed the moved armchair. I snatched my bag from the wet grass and ran. I sprinted through the misty Seattle afternoon, my lungs burning as I navigated the winding suburban streets. 2 blocks away, Richard Caldwell in his sleek black town car sat idling quietly beneath a massive oak tree. The rear door swung open before I even reached the curb. I practically collapsed into the plush leather seat, gasping for air and clutching the canvas bag to my chest like it was a physical lifeline. Richard took one look at my flushed face and tapped the glass partition. The driver immediately pulled away, leaving the affluent neighborhood and my toxic family far behind us. We did not speak during the drive back to the downtown core. I just focused on breathing while the sheer gravity of what I held in my lap settled over me. We arrived at Richard and his towering corporate headquarters, a massive glass and steel skyscraper that dominated the city skyline. He bypassed the main reception desk entirely and escorted me up a private elevator to his personal executive floor. We stepped into a sprawling boardroom that looked less like a traditional office and more like a military command center. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the dark Puget Sound, but my attention was entirely focused on the long mahogany table sitting right in the center of the room. I unzipped my canvas tote bag and emptied the contents onto the polished wood. The worn leather journals tumbled out. The heavy manila folders followed. Then, the silver digital voice recorder. Finally, I placed the encrypted flash drive containing Todd and his complete financial ruin on the table. Richard poured us both a cup of black coffee and took a seat across from me. For the next 2 hours, we sat in absolute silence, listening to my father and his gentle voice fill the sterile boardroom. We listened to his quiet confessions of a man trapped by his own family. We listened to the audio recordings of Todd aggressively demanding $250,000 to pay off his illegal shadow debts. We read through the journals detailing Brenda and her relentless cruelty alongside Chloe and her boundless entitlement. When the final audio recording ended, Richard leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked incredibly sad for a fleeting moment, mourning the silent suffering of his brilliant business partner. But that profound sadness quickly hardened into a cold and terrifying resolve. "Your father gave us the ammunition," Richard said, his blue eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity. Now it is our turn to pull the trigger. I nodded in agreement, pulling my laptop out of my bag and plugging in the encrypted flash drive. I connected it to the massive digital display screen mounted on the boardroom wall. As I organized the downloaded emails and financial statements, a newly synced calendar notification popped up on the corner of my screen. It was pulled directly from my mother and her digital planner, a system I had set up for her years ago, and which she clearly forgot I could still access. I clicked on the alert, my brow furrowing in confusion. The digital invitation filled the massive wall screen. It was an extravagant, professionally designed evite for a catered event taking place tomorrow morning at the family estate. The elegant script across the top read, "A New Beginnings Brunch." My stomach gave a sick jolt as I scanned the guest list. Brenda had invited 60 of her wealthiest friends' country club acquaintances and local high society socialites. The event details explicitly mentioned celebrating a beautiful new chapter of family prosperity and honoring my father and his legacy. The sheer audacity of it left me completely speechless. They were entirely unaware that the $4 million trust was frozen. Todd had clearly spun them a magnificent lie to keep them placated. They genuinely believed the money would hit their accounts by Monday morning, and they were already spending it to throw a lavish party designed solely to show off their newly stolen wealth to the neighborhood. "They are hosting a victory parade for a war they have not even won," I whispered, staring at the screen in complete disbelief. Richard stood up and walked toward the digital display, his eyes scanning the incredibly arrogant invitation. "They want an audience," he mused softly. "They want to stand in front of their wealthy peers and play the role of the triumphant, affluent survivors." He turned to look at me, and that dangerous, predatory smile returned to his face. "Then we should absolutely give them the audience they desire." He walked back to the conference table and picked up the stack of financial ledgers I had pulled from Todd and his hidden servers. He flipped through the pages documenting the $1.2 million in heavily leveraged illegal shadow debt. He studied the names of the aggressive private equity firms and the underground creditors who were threatening to ruin my brother-in-law. "I have spent 30 years operating in the commercial real estate sector," Richard explained, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I know the people who hold this paper. These are not regulated banks. These are ruthless private entities who only care about immediate returns. They are entirely motivated by cash and leverage." I watched in quiet awe as the billionaire developer went to work. He did not call his elite lawyers. He called the specific shadowy individuals who held Todd and his financial life in their hands. Richard spoke in low, clipped sentences. He casually dropped numbers that would make an ordinary person faint. He explained that a certain overly leveraged consultant was currently under active federal investigation for wire fraud, and that his collateral was completely worthless. But Richard offered them an immediate, incredibly lucrative alternative. He offered to buy up every single cent of Todd and his outstanding debt, paying them a massive premium to transfer the legal paper over to Caldwell Holdings by the end of the business day. The complex transactions were authorized and executed with terrifying speed. The power of a billionaire stepping into a relatively small debt dispute was absolute. Within an hour, Richard Caldwell had completely absorbed the $1.2 million burden. He ended the final call and set his phone down on the mahogany table. He looked over at me, his eyes gleaming with a ruthless satisfaction. "It is done," Richard announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Todd no longer owes money to random shadow creditors. He owes it entirely to me. I own his consulting firm. I own his luxury cars. I own every single asset attached to his fraudulent name. Tomorrow morning, your mother wants to celebrate her new beginnings in front of 60 people. We are going to attend that brunch, Sarah. And we are going to serve them a reality check they will never forget." The heavy mahogany table in Richard Caldwell's corporate boardroom was covered in the wreckage of my family lies. I stood by the massive glass windows, watching the Seattle rain wash over the city skyline. The storm outside perfectly matched the turbulent exhaustion settling into my bones. We had just completely dismantled Todd and his fraudulent financial empire in a matter of hours. Richard was currently across the room, quietly instructing his executive assistant to finalize the debt transfer paperwork. For the first time all day, my body actually felt the crushing weight of everything that had happened. I reached up and rubbed my aching temples. I just wanted to close my eyes and breathe. Then my phone buzzed on the polished conference table. The short, sharp vibration pulled me out of my temporary peace. I walked over and picked up the device. The screen lit up with a new message notification. It was from Chloe. My heart gave a familiar little jump of anxiety before my new reality grounded me. I swiped the screen open to read the text. It was a masterpiece of fake sympathy and calculated cruelty. Chloe had typed out a message that was clearly meant to be the final nail in my coffin. She said she was so incredibly sorry to hear that I had missed my flight back to Seattle. She said it was such a tragedy that I could not be there for the probate hearing when the family needed me the most. Then came the real dagger. She told me not to bother coming back to the house because our mother had already hired a locksmith to change every single lock on the exterior doors. She ended the message with a sickeningly sweet sign-off telling me good luck out there. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. There was absolutely no mention of the fact that the trust accounts had been frozen by a judge just hours earlier. They were completely and blissfully unaware of the judicial injunction. Todd was clearly still maintaining his desperate charade, spinning a web of lies to keep Brenda and Chloe happily distracted with their extravagant brunch preparations. My sister actually believed she was sending a victorious farewell message to a defeated sibling. She honestly thought I was sitting on a curb in Los Angeles, completely destitute, and crying over my locked childhood home. A few hours ago, that text message would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. It would have made me feel entirely worthless and completely unloved. But standing in a billionaire private war room with the absolute proof of their impending destruction resting right at my fingertips, I did not feel sad. I did not feel rejected. I felt a cold and powerful surge of pure, unadulterated motivation. I set the phone down next to the high-speed laser printer Richard's assistant had wheeled into the room for me. The time for feeling hurt was officially over. It was time to put my corporate accounting skills to their ultimate use. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. I opened the massive encrypted file I had pulled from Todd and his hidden cloud server. I did not just want to walk into their lavish brunch and make wild accusations. I wanted to present a forensic portfolio so incredibly detailed and irrefutable that it would leave absolutely zero room for debate. I wanted every single one of their high society friends to see the exact rotting foundation their pathetic wealth was built upon. The printer hummed to life, spitting out warm, crisp pages of undeniable evidence. I started with the foundation of their entire scheme. I printed the forged trust addendum they had submitted to the courts that morning, placing it side by side with the genuine, legally binding documents I had recovered from my father and his hidden floor safe. The differences in the signatures were glaringly obvious when placed under the bright boardroom lights. I slipped the real trust documents into a thick black leather binder, smoothing the plastic sheet protectors with absolute precision. Next, I tackled Todd and his magnificent financial illusion. I pulled the raw data from his consulting firm ledgers. I printed out the dummy vendor invoices, the illegal wire transfer confirmations, and the desperate internal memos highlighting his massive cash flow deficits. I organized the embezzlement records chronologically, creating a crystal-clear timeline of his federal wire fraud. I used a bright yellow highlighter to mark the exact dates and amounts he had stolen from his elderly clients. I placed these pages into a second matching leather binder. This was the exact evidence that would guarantee him a very long stay in a federal penitentiary. The final section of my portfolio was the most devastating. Richard walked over and handed me a freshly printed stack of legal documents tied together with a thick silver clip. It was the complete and total transfer of Todd and his $1.2 million shadow debt. The paperwork explicitly named Richard Caldwell as the sole owner of the massive liabilities. Attached to the back of the transfer documents were the aggressively worded foreclosure notices and asset seizure warrants that Todd original creditors had drafted. I placed these debt acquisition files into a third red leather binder. This was the killing blow. I lined the 3 heavy binders up perfectly in the center of the mahogany table. They looked like standard corporate reports, but they contained the absolute ruin of the people who had tried to throw me away like actual garbage. I ran my hand over the smooth leather covers. My father had spent years quietly compiling the truth, knowing that one day I would need it to defend myself against their relentless greed. He had given me the sword, and Richard had graciously provided the shield. I picked up my phone and opened the text thread with Chloe. I read her incredibly smug message one last time. "Good luck out there," she had written. I smiled. It was a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. I did not type a reply. There was absolutely no need to warn them about the storm that was currently gathering over their heads. They had spent my entire life treating me like a naive, obedient child who would simply accept whatever scraps of affection they decided to throw my way. They truly believed I was weak. I stacked the 3 binders and placed them carefully into my canvas tote bag. The heavy weight of the paper felt incredibly grounding. I looked out the massive windows at the dark city below. Tomorrow morning, my mother was hosting 60 of her wealthiest friends to celebrate her new beginnings. She wanted an audience to witness her triumphant entry into high society. I was going to make absolutely certain she got exactly the show she deserved. The morning air was crisp and bright as I stepped out of the hired car, a block away from my childhood home. The heavy Seattle mist had completely burned off overnight, leaving behind a deceptively beautiful Sunday morning. The wide suburban street was practically choked with expensive imported vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts were jogging back and forth across the manicured lawns, carefully parking the luxury sedans and sleek sports cars belonging to my mother and her elite country club circle. The sheer scale of the event was staggering. They had spared absolutely no expense for a massive party funded by money they did not even possess. I walked up the long, curving driveway completely ignored by the busy catering staff, unloading crates of expensive champagne from a delivery van. I slipped through the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The house was completely transformed. Massive arrangements of white lilies and orchids sat on every available surface, filling the air with a suffocatingly sweet perfume. The gentle melodies of a live string quartet drifted from the back patio, mingling with the loud and arrogant laughter of 60 wealthy guests. Waiters in sharp black vests circulated through the crowded rooms carrying silver trays loaded with caviar appetizers and crystal flutes of imported sparkling wine. I stayed near the back of the formal dining room, partially hidden behind a towering floral display, and just watched. Chloe was standing near the patio doors, wearing a designer silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. She was laughing loudly, tossing her perfectly styled hair, and accepting flattering compliments from a group of older women dripping in diamonds. Todd was holding court near the massive stone fireplace. He had a fresh glass of expensive bourbon in his hand, gesturing broadly as he entertained a group of local real estate developers. He looked completely relaxed and utterly arrogant. He was parading around my father and his house like a conquering king, completely unaware that Richard Caldwell now owned every single asset tied to his fraudulent name. He was a dead man, walking smiling warmly at his wealthy peers, while the absolute proof of his federal crimes rested safely inside the heavy canvas bag slung over my shoulder. Then the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The loud chatter in the room began to quiet down as the sharp and distinct sound of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute cut through the noise. I looked toward the center of the sprawling living room. My mother, Brenda, was standing on the slightly elevated landing near the grand staircase. She wore a stunning black morning dress that somehow managed to look both incredibly tragic and devastatingly expensive. She waited for complete and total silence to fall over the 60 guests before she offered them a sad and perfectly practiced smile. "Thank you all so much for being here today." Brenda began, her voice trembling with just the right amount of carefully manufactured emotion. I know it might seem slightly unorthodox to host a gathering so soon after losing my wonderful husband Arthur, but as I look around this room at all the beautiful faces of our dearest friends, I know in my heart that this is exactly what he would have wanted. He would have wanted his family to be surrounded by love and support during our darkest hour. She paused dramatically, lifting a delicate lace handkerchief to dab at the corners of her completely dry eyes. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the affluent crowd. Older women nodded in understanding while men raised their glasses in quiet respect to a man they barely knew. "The past month has been an absolute nightmare for our family." Brenda continued, her voice growing slightly stronger, adopting the tone of a brave and resilient matriarch. "When Arthur passed away, he left us dealing with a massive mountain of complicated and frightening legal matters. There were days when I truly thought I would simply collapse under the sheer weight of the stress and the grief. I did not know how we were going to survive the financial complexities he left behind, But a family is only as strong as its bonds, she said, gesturing warmly toward my sister and her criminal husband. I could never have navigated this harrowing journey without my beautiful daughter Chloe and my incredibly brilliant son-in-law Todd. They stepped up when absolutely everything was falling apart. They took control of the terrible situation and fought tirelessly to protect our home and secure the future Arthur always dreamed we would have. They are the true definition of family loyalty. I gripped the handles of my canvas bag so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was absolutely no mention of me. There was no mention of the daughter who spent 7 years doing their taxes for free, balancing their checkbooks, and bailing them out of their own careless mistakes. There was no mention of the daughter they had maliciously stranded in Los Angeles just 24 hours ago. In Brenda and her twisted narrative, I simply did not exist. I was entirely erased from the family history discarded and forgotten, so they could claim the spotlight and steal the wealth. Today is not just about mourning the past, Brenda announced, raising her crystal flute high into the air. Today is about celebrating family resilience. Thanks to the tireless efforts of Todd and Chloe, the estate is finally secure. The massive burdens have been lifted from our shoulders. We are officially stepping out of the darkness and into a beautifully blessed new chapter of prosperity and peace. So please raise your glasses with me. To Arthur, to unshakable family bonds, and to our bright and beautiful new beginnings. The 60 high society guests raised their glasses in unison, murmuring their polite agreements before taking a sip of the expensive champagne paid for by the sweat of a man they never respected. They cheered for a woman who was currently attempting to steal a $4 million commercial trust from her own child. They celebrated a man who was drowning in over $1 million of shadow debt and wire fraud. The loud applause echoed through the grand living room, a sickening wave of validation for 3 of the most manipulative people I had ever known. I stood in the shadows near the dining room, feeling the heavy weight of the 3 leather binders resting inside my bag. The victory parade had reached its absolute peak. It was exactly the right time to stop the music. I stepped out from the shadows of the formal dining room and walked directly into the blinding light of the grand living room. The heavy canvas bag hung securely over my right shoulder, holding the absolute ruin of my family. I did not walk into that massive space alone. Richard Caldwell moved smoothly to my side, and his presence instantly radiated absolute authority and quiet menace. Behind us, 2 massive private security guards stepped into the room. Their dark-tailored suits and stoic faces looked completely out of place among the pastel dresses and the extravagant floral arrangements. We moved as a unified front, an undeniable force of reality crashing into a room built entirely on greedy delusions. The live string quartet was the very first to notice the intrusion. The cellist faltered and missed a vital note. Within seconds, the beautiful classical melody completely unraveled into an awkward and heavy silence. 60 high society guests turned their heads almost simultaneously. The cheerful chatter of the wealthy crowd evaporated into a thick and suffocating tension. They stared at us in absolute shock. I could see the profound confusion rippling through the sea of country club acquaintances, local socialites, and wealthy real estate developers. Crystal champagne flutes hovered frozen in the air as every single pair of eyes locked onto the 4 strangers who had just interrupted their lavish Sunday celebration. Brenda was still standing on the elevated landing near the grand staircase. The triumphant and tearful smile she had just paraded in front of her captive audience slid right off her face. For a split second, I saw pure, unadulterated terror flash in her eyes. She recognized Richard Caldwell immediately, and she knew exactly what his billionaire presence meant. But my mother was a creature of intense pride and endless manipulation. She could never surrender in front of an audience. She had to control the narrative before the whispers could begin. Brenda quickly lowered her glass and plastered a look of deep, maternal concern across her face. "Sarah," she gasped loudly, making sure her trembling voice carried to every single corner of the silent room. "What on earth are you doing here?" We were absolutely frantic with worry. She turned to her wealthy guests, offering them a long and suffering sigh. "Please excuse this sudden interruption," she told the crowd, while pressing a delicate hand to her chest. "My youngest daughter has been struggling terribly since Arthur passed away. We arranged a beautiful family trip to Los Angeles to help her heal, but she completely abandoned us at the airport yesterday. She simply vanished without a word. We have been sick with worry, and now she decides to crash this private family gathering with strange men, Chloe stepped forward, linking her arm tightly with Todd. She glared at me with pure venom, masking her own rising panic. "You need to leave right now, Sarah," Chloe hissed angrily. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are ruining a beautiful memorial for our father. You did not even have the decency to show up for the probate hearing this morning. You are sick, and you need professional help before you destroy what is left of this family." I stood completely still. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not offer them the chaotic emotional meltdown they desperately wanted me to display so they could dismiss me as unstable to their wealthy friends. I looked around the room at the 60 high society guests who were watching this dramatic spectacle unfold. Then I looked directly at my mother. I channeled every ounce of my professional training. I used the cold, precise, and completely emotionless voice I used when auditing fraudulent corporate ledgers. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 28 years being treated like a servant, and who was finally taking her power back. "I did not vanish at the airport, Mother," I said, my voice echoing clearly and firmly through the massive room. "You deliberately stole my identification and stranded me out of state so you could attend a fraudulent probate hearing without my legal interference. You hired a locksmith to change the locks on this house to keep me away from my own property. And you threw this lavish party today to celebrate stealing a $4 million trust fund that does not actually belong to you." A collective gasp echoed through the grand living room. Several older women covered their mouths in pure shock. The wealthy real estate developers who had just been laughing with Todd suddenly took a cautious step backward, sensing the extreme danger radiating through the room. Brenda's face flushed a deep, angry red. The illusion of the grieving widow shattered instantly. "How dare you speak to me that way in my own home?" Brenda shouted, completely dropping her fragile persona. "This house belongs to me. You are completely delusional. I am calling the police to have you and these men removed immediately." "You will not be calling anyone, Brenda," Richard Caldwell stated calmly, stepping forward so the entire crowd could see him clearly. "I believe we all know exactly who I am. And I assure you, if the authorities are summoned to this estate today, they will not be removing Sarah. They will be arresting your son-in-law for massive federal wire fraud and the forgery of legal trust documents." Todd turned the color of spoiled milk. The confident swagger he had been parading around with just moments ago completely vanished. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, and his hands trembled so violently that his expensive bourbon spilled over the rim of his glass and dripped onto the hardwood floor. He looked exactly like a cornered animal desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. Chloe dropped his arm and stared at him in total confusion. I walked slowly across the polished floor, moving directly toward the stone fireplace where Todd was standing. The wealthy crowd parted for me automatically, treating me like a force of nature they dared not touch. I reached into my heavy canvas tote bag and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. It contained the exact forensic proof of his shadow debts, the forged trust documents, and the formal legal notice that Richard Caldwell now owned every single asset he had ever touched. I did not shout. I did not gloat. I simply stopped right in front of him and held the heavy envelope out. "You assured my mother that the trust accounts were frozen due to a simple clerical error," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper that carried perfectly in the deadly silent room. "You convinced these people to celebrate a future that you have already destroyed. I suggest you open that envelope and explain to your wife exactly why you owe this man $1.2 million and why you are about to lose absolutely everything." Todd stared at the thick manila envelope in his hands, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His pristine image, the carefully curated facade of a brilliant and successful entrepreneur that he had spent years building, was crumbling right before my eyes. The heavy silence in the grand living room was absolute and suffocating. 60 pairs of eyes belonging to Seattle, most elite socialites, wealthy real estate developers, and relentless country club gossips were pinned directly on him. He slowly pulled the stack of papers from the envelope, his fingers trembling so violently that the thick pages rustled audibly in the quiet room. I watched his panicked eyes dart back and forth across the top sheet. It was the formal notice of debt transfer explicitly stating that Richard Caldwell now held the entire sum of his massive, highly leveraged liabilities. Todd opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His face had gone a sickening shade of pale gray, and a thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple, staining the crisp collar of his expensive custom-tailored shirt. "What is that?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and tight with rising panic. She stepped closer to her husband, reaching out to snatch the papers from his shaking hands. "Todd, what did she just hand you? Tell these people she is lying. Tell them to throw her out right now so we can finish honoring our father." Todd did not look at her. He could not even lift his head to meet the gaze of the audience he had been entertaining just moments before. He just stared at the undeniable proof of his total financial ruin. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I turned my attention completely to my older sister. For my entire life, Chloe had treated me like an embarrassing stain on the family legacy. She had mocked my accounting degree, calling me a boring number cruncher, while she paraded around on the arm of a man she believed was a financial genius. It was finally time for her to understand exactly what my numbers had uncovered. "Your husband is not a successful business consultant." "Chloe," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to the women dripping in diamonds standing just a few feet away. "He does not manage elite portfolios or advise top-tier corporate clients. His entire firm is a massive hollow shell game designed to fund a lifestyle you two absolutely cannot afford." Chloe's face twisted with pure fury and deep denial. "You are insane," she spat, her hands curling into tight fists at her sides. "Todd makes millions. He is securing our future." "He is stealing your future," I corrected her calmly, taking a deliberate step closer. "I spent the last 48 hours doing a complete forensic audit of his hidden servers. Your brilliant husband has been systematically embezzling funds from his own elderly clients for over 3 years. He created dummy vendor invoices and routed their retirement savings directly into offshore accounts to cover his massive underground gambling debts. He is not an entrepreneur. He is a thief who preys on the vulnerable." A collective gasp ripped through the grand room. A prominent local real estate developer, a man who had just been clinking champagne glasses and laughing with Todd, let out a sharp sound of absolute disgust. He took 3 deliberate steps backward, putting immediate physical distance between himself and my brother-in-law. The wealthy women in Chloe's exclusive social circle began murmuring frantically to one another, their eyes wide with shock and harsh judgment. In their affluent world, going broke was a terrible sin, but getting caught stealing to maintain appearances was an absolute social death sentence. "That is a complete fabrication," Brenda shouted from the landing, her voice cracking loudly as she desperately tried to regain control of her ruined celebration. "Todd is a wonderful provider. You are just jealous of your sister and her beautiful life because you have absolutely nothing." I turned to look at my mother, perfectly matching her hysterical energy with cold, absolute precision. If he is such a wonderful provider, then perhaps he can explain why he is currently $1.2 million in debt to aggressive shadow creditors. I stated loudly, my voice slicing through the heavy air. Because that is the exact amount he owed to private unregulated lenders until about 2 hours ago. He was completely leveraged. He maxed out every single line of credit borrowed against assets he did not actually own, and was mere days away from violent foreclosure. I turned back to Chloe, watching the vibrant color rapidly drain from her perfectly manicured face. "Your beautiful life is entirely financed by stolen money and illegal loans, Chloe. That is exactly why Todd tried to extort our father 2 years ago. He demanded $250,000 in silence money, threatening to expose Dad hidden accounts to you and Brenda unless he paid up. Dad refused to be intimidated. He recorded the entire extortion attempt and locked it in a floor safe. I have the audio files right here in my bag." Chloe staggered backward as if I had physically struck her. She looked at Todd, her eyes begging him to deny it, begging him to spin another beautiful lie to save her social standing in front of her friends. But Todd remained completely paralyzed. He knew the forensic evidence was absolutely bulletproof. "And that brings us to the most important part of today," I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. Todd was desperate. The shadow creditors were calling in his massive debts. So he orchestrated this entire probate scheme. He forged the trust addendum to drain our father $4 million estate because it was his only remaining lifeline. He convinced you both that the courts had simply made a clerical error yesterday, urging you to go shopping for luxury cars, so you would not ask any complicated questions, while he frantically tried to find a way to access the frozen accounts. I pointed to the thick envelope still shaking in Todd's hands. "But those accounts are never unfreezing for you, Todd. Mr. Caldwell just purchased every single penny of your underground debt. You do not owe the shadow banks anymore. You owe him. He owns your firm, he owns your luxury vehicles, and he owns whatever is left of your fraudulent life. The absolute finality of my words settled over the room like a heavy winter storm. The high society guests were no longer whispering. They were staring at Todd with a mixture of intense horror and total repulsion. The man they had just toasted as a family savior was publicly exposed as a desperate criminal, and to make matters completely clear, I added, delivering the final and absolute blow, those forged documents you filed yesterday have already been flagged. My corporate attorneys have officially submitted the genuine trust deed, along with your embezzlement records, and the extortion audio directly to the federal authorities. You are not just completely broke, Todd. You are facing an imminent federal indictment for wire fraud and the forgery of legal documents in a probate court. Chloe let out a sharp, devastated sob, her hands flying to cover her mouth as the reality of her shattered life finally crashed down upon her. The country club friends she had desperately tried to impress were already pulling out their phones, frantically texting the massive scandal to anyone who was not in the room. Todd dropped the manila envelope, the papers scattering across the polished hardwood floor, his magnificent illusion completely and utterly destroyed. The heavy thud of the manila envelope hitting the floor felt like a bomb detonating in the center of the living room. The thick stack of foreclosure notices and embezzlement ledgers spilled across the polished hardwood, fanning out like a deck of toxic playing cards. For a fraction of a second, the room remained entirely frozen. No one took a breath. No one moved a muscle. Then, the delicate crystal champagne flute slipped straight through Chloe and her trembling fingers. It hit the floorboards with a sharp and violent crash, throwing glittering shards of glass and expensive imported wine across the toes of her designer shoes. That single, shattering sound was the catalyst that completely broke the spell. The absolute silence of the grand estate instantly dissolved into a chaotic symphony of horrified gasps and frantic aggressive whispers. The 60 affluent guests, the very people my mother had desperately gathered to witness her glorious ascension into high society, were now witnessing the brutal and unvarnished destruction of her entire legacy. The powerful real estate developers and wealthy country club matriarchs did not offer sympathy. In their ruthless social circles, a sudden financial downfall was a contagious disease. I watched as women dripping in diamonds physically recoiled, pulling their expensive silk wraps tightly around their shoulders, as if Todd and his crimes might somehow rub off on them. Several couples were already inching toward the grand mahogany front doors, abandoning their half-empty drinks on side tables, absolutely desperate to escape the blast radius of this magnificent scandal. Chloe did not even look at the broken glass at her feet. She stared at her husband with a wild and unhinged expression. The carefully crafted illusion of her flawless, wealthy marriage was burning to the ground in real time, and the flames were reflecting brightly in her eyes. "Tell them it is a lie!" Todd, Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing through the rising murmur of the crowd. Her face was flushed a chaotic mottled red. "Tell them she forged those papers. Tell them we are not broke." But Todd could not speak. The charismatic, fast-talking consultant who had spent years manipulating my father and treating me like an unpaid servant was entirely gone. He stood there trembling, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He looked past me, locking eyes with Richard Caldwell, who stood silently by my side like an impenetrable wall of corporate retribution. Todd knew that Richard possessed the limitless resources to execute every single threat in that envelope. There was no charm or slick excuse that could save him from a billionaire who held his entire financial existence in the palm of his hand. When Todd finally opened his mouth, all he managed was a pathetic whimpering sound. "Please, Chloe," he stammered, raising his hands in a desperate, placating gesture. "Please, do not make a scene right now. We can fix this. I just need a little more time." The realization hit my sister with the force of a speeding freight train. He was not denying it. He was begging for time. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life expecting the world to be handed to her on a silver platter, suddenly understood that she was tethered to a sinking ship. "You lied to me!" Chloe screamed, lunging forward and striking his chest with her open palms. "You told me we were rich. You told me the judge made a mistake and that we were getting millions tomorrow. You made me go to the dealership and pick out a car while you knew you were losing everything. You disgusting, pathetic thief." She hit him again, completely abandoning her refined country club persona. The elite guests watched in absolute horror as the golden couple tore each other apart in the center of the room. Todd tried to grab her wrists, shushing her frantically and begging her to lower her voice, completely terrified of the wealthy audience watching his ultimate humiliation. He looked small, weak, and entirely broken. The gilded cage they had built together was finally locking them inside. I stood perfectly still, watching the destruction unfold, with a cold and clear satisfaction. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I had spent my entire youth shrinking myself down, silencing my own needs, and working tirelessly in the shadows just to keep this ungrateful family afloat. I had let them convince me I was nothing but a boring, invisible bookkeeper. Now they were finally seeing the true cost of underestimating the person who actually balanced their books. "Stop this immediately." The booming, hysterical voice belonged to Brenda. She marched down the final steps of the grand staircase, her expensive morning dress swishing furiously around her ankles. She shoved her way through the murmuring crowd, placing herself directly between me and her precious golden child. My mother face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She was watching her entire social standing evaporate into thin air, and she was desperate to salvage whatever scraps of prestige she could grasp. "You are a vicious, jealous liar, Sarah," Brenda spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You could not stand seeing your sister happy. You could not stand that Arthur left the estate to us instead of you. So you come into my home, you crash my private event, and you parade these ridiculous fabricated papers around to embarrass us in front of my dear friends." I looked at her entirely unfazed by her aggressive posturing. "I did not fabricate anything, Brenda," I replied evenly. "Todd and his embezzlement records are entirely real. His shadow debts are real. His impending federal indictment is absolutely real." "I do not care what kind of garbage you printed off your little computer," Brenda screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Todd will hire the best defense attorneys in the state. We will crush you in court. You think you can destroy us just because you found some silly accounting errors? You are forgetting one very important detail, Sarah. We still have your father and his money. We still have the $4 million commercial trust." Brenda turned to the remaining guests, forcing a manic, terrifying smile onto her face. "Do not listen to a word this unstable girl says," she announced to the crowd, her voice dripping with toxic desperation. "We are incredibly wealthy. The probate court is releasing the entire $4 million trust to me by tomorrow morning. I am going to use that money to completely destroy her. I will sue you for every ounce of defamation, Sarah. I will bury you in legal fees until you are living on the streets. You cannot win because we have the millions." She crossed her arms and glared at me, panting heavily, absolutely convinced that the massive trust fund was her ultimate impenetrable shield. She truly believed her own lies. She believed she could simply buy her way out of a federal crime and completely erase my existence one final time. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her screaming hysteria. I simply reached my hand into the deep pocket of my heavy canvas tote bag. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cool surface of the thick, black leather binder I had assembled earlier in Richard Corporate War Room. "You are not going to sue anyone, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through her manic delusions like a blade of solid ice. "And you are certainly not touching a single dime of my father and his money." I slowly pulled the heavy black binder from my bag, letting the polished leather catch the bright overhead lights of the living room, completely ready to show my mother the absolute truth about the man she had manipulated for decades. The smooth black leather of the binder felt cool against my palms. It was a stark contrast to the burning heat of the anger radiating from my mother. Brenda stood on the stairs with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her chin was tilted upward in a posture of absolute defiance. She truly believed she held the ultimate trump card. In her mind, the $4 million commercial trust was her divine right. She thought it was the final reward for enduring a marriage to a man she considered entirely beneath her. She was banking her entire future and her precious social standing on a pile of money she did not understand. I opened the heavy cover of the binder and let the pages fall open on a nearby catered cocktail table. The wealthy guests leaned in instinctively, their insatiable appetite for gossip completely overriding their polite society manners. They wanted to see the wreckage. "You have spent the last month bragging to everyone in this room about your magnificent windfall, Brenda," I said. My voice was steady and carried easily over the soft classical music still playing faintly from the patio. You claimed Dad left you an empire. You told your country club friends that you were stepping into a blessed new chapter of immense wealth. But you never actually stopped to ask where that massive sum of money came from. You were so blinded by your own greed that you never questioned the origin of the $4 million. Brenda let out a harsh and dismissive scoff. It came from his real estate investments, she snapped loudly. He spent decades hiding his earnings from his own family. It was community property, and now it rightfully belongs to me and Chloe. We are taking back what he stole from us. I shook my head slowly, feeling a deep sense of pity for her profound ignorance. Dad never stole a single dime from you, I corrected her gently. He just protected his brilliance from your constant demands. He did not build those commercial real estate portfolios by himself. He had a silent partner. A man who recognized his genius when you only saw an inconvenience. I stepped aside and gestured toward the imposing figure standing quietly to my right. Richard Caldwell moved forward. The sheer gravity of his presence seemed to swallow all the light in the room. He did not look like a man crashing a suburban brunch. He looked like an apex predator, evaluating a very small and very trapped prey. As he stepped into the center of the living room, a wave of intense recognition washed over the affluent crowd. These were people who worshipped wealth and power. They absolutely knew the face of the billionaire developer who practically owned the Seattle skyline. "Allow me to introduce myself," Richard said. His deep voice resonated with effortless authority. "My name is Richard Caldwell. Your late husband Arthur was not just a passing acquaintance. He was my most trusted friend, and my secret business partner for over 15 years. A collective murmur of astonishment rippled through the 60 guests. Several men in expensive suits literally dropped their jaws. The idea that Arthur, the quiet and unassuming man Brenda had relentlessly belittled, was secretly partnered with a billionaire titan of industry was completely incomprehensible to them. Brenda stared at Richard with her eyes wide and panicked. The solid foundation of her reality was cracking apart in real time. That $4 million trust you have been so desperately trying to access does not consist of random family savings. Richard continued, his gaze fixed directly on my mother. It is the exact monetary value of Arthur and his silent shares in Caldwell Holdings. I personally funded that entire trust last month as a final buyout of his equity. And Arthur explicitly mandated that every single penny of that corporate buyout was to be placed into an ironclad trust designated solely and exclusively for his youngest daughter, Sarah. He wanted to ensure that the one person who actually cared for him would never have to suffer under your financial abuse ever again. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, but no sound materialized. The magnificent narrative she had just fed her friends was completely dead. The illusion was gone. I did not give her a chance to recover her footing. I reached back into my heavy canvas tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of stapled document packets. I had spent hours at the corporate office making sure I had enough copies for everyone who mattered in this room. I walked right up to the front row of the gathered crowd and began handing the packets directly to Brenda and her closest high society friends. The elite socialites took the papers eagerly. Their manicured hands traced the bold legal letterheads. I wanted them to read the absolute truth for themselves without any filter or spin from my manipulative family. If you look at the first page of that packet, I instructed the crowd you will see an official judicial injunction. It is a court order stamped and signed by a federal judge just a few hours ago. It completely freezes all transfers, liquidations, and modifications regarding the Caldwell Buyout Trust. The money you are celebrating today is locked away entirely out of your reach. Chloe grabbed a packet from a nearby woman and stared at the bright red court stamps. Her face turned a sickly shade of green. She looked up at me completely devastated. "But Todd said he filed the addendum," she whispered weakly. "He said the courts accepted the new paperwork giving us full control." "He did file it, Chloe," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh and uncompromising tone. "But the court rejected it the moment my corporate legal team introduced the genuine trust agreement. Which brings us to the final piece of this pathetic puzzle." I turned my attention back to my mother. Brenda was gripping the wooden banister of the staircase so tightly her hands were trembling. Her knuckles were stark white against the dark mahogany wood. Todd was the one drowning in shadow debt, I explained to the captivated audience. He was the one desperate enough to orchestrate this massive theft. But Todd was not the one who actually signed the fraudulent trust addendum. He needed someone with intimate access to Dad and his personal files to perfectly mimic his handwriting. He needed someone greedy enough to risk everything for a quick and easy payout. I pointed directly at the second page of the distributed packets. The wealthy guests flipped the heavy pages following my instructions with hungry eyes. The elegant dining room was filled with the crisp sound of rustling paper. "That is a certified forensic handwriting analysis," I announced loudly, ensuring every single person heard me. "My lawyers had an expert compare the signature on your newly discovered addendum with 30 years of my father and his authentic tax returns. The results are completely conclusive, and they have already been submitted to the authorities." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the staircase, trapping my mother under the harsh glare of 60 judgmental stares. The silence in the room was absolute and entirely unforgiving. "Todd may have designed the embezzlement scheme, Brenda," I said, staring right into her terrified eyes. "But you are the one who actually committed the forgery. You sat at his desk and you traced a dead man and his signature to steal his final gift to me. You are a forger. And you are going to prison." The air in the grand living room grew so heavy and stagnant it felt physically hard to breathe. 60 of Seattle's wealthiest socialites stood completely paralyzed. Their collective gaze shifted rapidly from my unapologetic face to the terrified, trembling figure of my mother. Brenda opened her mouth. Her jaw worked up and down frantically, but absolutely no words came out. The absolute silence was my ultimate cue. I reached into my heavy canvas tote bag one final time. My fingers brushed past the remaining legal files and closed tightly around the small silver digital voice recorder I had retrieved from the hidden floor safe just yesterday. I pulled it out and held it up under the glittering light of the crystal chandelier. Brenda had rented a high-quality portable sound system for her manipulative victory speech. The microphone she had used to spin her toxic web of deceit was resting on a tall metal stand just a few feet away. I walked over and grabbed the microphone. I held the silver digital recorder directly up to the black mesh of the audio receiver. "You claim I am a vicious liar, Brenda," I said. My voice echoed loudly and clearly through the massive surround sound speakers. "You claim you and Todd were the loyal saviors of this family, but we do not need to rely on my word. We can simply listen to the man you spent 30 years trying to systematically break." I pressed the play button on the silver device. A brief hiss of static blasted through the tall speakers. It was followed immediately by a sound that made my chest ache with a profound, raw emotion. It was my father. His voice was deep and steady. It was entirely free of the subservient hesitation he used whenever Brenda was in the room. He calmly stated his full legal name and the exact date. He confirmed his absolute clarity of mind for the legal record. Then he began to speak his ultimate truth directly into the room full of people who had ignored and diminished him for decades. The recording was absolutely devastating. My father outlined his exact plans for his $4 million commercial equity. He formally declared me as his sole legal beneficiary. He stated explicitly that I was the only person in his house who had ever treated him with genuine respect and unconditional love. But he did not stop at the financial declarations. His voice grew incredibly cold and hard as he detailed Brenda and her relentless psychological manipulation. He described her endless vanity and her cruel isolation tactics. He spoke about the way she constantly belittled his hard work while eagerly spending every single dime he brought home. He detailed exactly how Brenda and Chloe viewed him, as nothing more than a human bank account. He called them out as parasites who treated him like a necessary nuisance solely to fund their extravagant lifestyles. He specifically mentioned the day Brenda mocked his inexpensive clothes in front of her country club friends, while secretly wearing a diamond necklace paid for by his commercial investments. He exposed the lies Chloe told to extract thousands of dollars for fake business ventures. Every single shameful family secret was laid bare under the bright morning sunlight pouring through the large patio doors. I slowly lowered the microphone and watched my mother as the final echoes of my father and his profound disappointment faded into the stifling quiet. The physical transformation of Brenda was swift and absolute. The arrogant, wealthy matriarch completely vanished. Her knees literally buckled beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto the bottom step of the grand mahogany staircase. Her incredibly expensive black morning dress pooled around her feet like a deflated parachute. She stared blankly at the polished hardwood floor. Her chest heaved dramatically as she gasped for air. She finally understood the terrifying magnitude of her complete ruin. The $4 million she had already mentally spent was completely and permanently gone. Her fraudulent legal claims were entirely shattered. But worst of all, for a woman entirely obsessed with superficial appearances, her meticulously crafted social standing was obliterated in real time. The country club elites did not rush forward to comfort her. They backed away as if she carried a highly contagious disease. Women she had played tennis with for 15 years looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Wealthy men who had just toasted to her fabricated resilience were already turning their backs and marching briskly toward the grand front doors. Brenda was officially a total social pariah. Her fraud, her intense cruelty, and her impending federal charges were now public knowledge in the only affluent circle she had ever cared about impressing. She was utterly and completely ruined. Across the massive living room, Todd was slumped weakly against the large stone fireplace. He looked exactly like a desperate man waiting for a ruthless executioner. Chloe was weeping loudly and hysterically. Her perfect, expensive makeup was running down her flushed face in dark, ugly streaks. The crushing reality of her husband and his massive $1.2 million shadow debt finally sank into her entitled brain. They were completely trapped in a financial and legal prison of their own making. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Richard Caldwell. A deep and quiet sense of absolute justice settled peacefully over my tired mind. The exhausting war was officially over. The greedy people who had maliciously tried to discard me were standing amidst the burning wreckage of their own unparalleled arrogance. I took a deep, cleansing breath. I was entirely ready to turn around and walk out of that toxic house for the very last time. I was ready to start my brand new life with the resources and the respect I had rightfully earned. But before I could take a single step toward the exit, a brand new sound pierced the heavy, awkward murmurs of the rapidly retreating guests. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the far distance. It quickly grew much louder and significantly sharper. The unmistakable piercing shriek of police sirens began echoing up the long, winding suburban driveway. The bright, flashing lights cut through the morning mist, coming closer and closer to collect exactly what they were owed. The guests who had rushed out the front doors were now scrambling back inside to avoid the incoming fleet of law enforcement vehicles. Red and blue lights began flashing violently against the large living room windows, casting frantic, colorful shadows across Brenda and her pale, devastated face. The justice my father had carefully orchestrated from beyond the grave was finally arriving to deliver the ultimate punishment. I simply stood there and watched the glorious finale unfold. The heavy wooden doors of the grand estate were suddenly illuminated by a violent wash of red and blue lights. The flashing colors bounced off the crystal chandeliers and painted the pale faces of the wealthy guests in alternating shades of crimson and sapphire. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The high society crowd was completely paralyzed by the deafening wail of the sirens echoing up the manicured driveway. They were accustomed to seeing police cars only when they needed an escort for a charity gala, or to quietly handle a simple noise complaint against a loud neighbor. Seeing a massive fleet of law enforcement vehicles aggressively block the entrance to a private country club brunch was something entirely outside their affluent reality. I stood next to Richard Caldwell, watching the magnificent display unfold with a steady and calm heartbeat. The justice my father had meticulously prepared for was finally parking right on the front lawn. Brenda frantically smoothed the front of her expensive morning dress and marched toward the heavy glass windows. She let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded like dry leaves snapping in the bitter wind. She turned to her terrified friends and waved a dismissive hand. She announced to the room that it must be a simple misunderstanding. She suggested that perhaps someone parked in a fire lane or a foolish neighbor complained about the classical music. She stated she would go speak to the officers and clear this entire mess up immediately. She truly believed her fake wealth and her fragile social status made her completely immune to actual legal consequences. She honestly thought she could just flash a polite smile and send the authorities on their way. But I knew the absolute truth. Those officers were not here to issue a petty parking citation. The heavy mahogany doors swung open before Brenda could even reach the grand entryway. 4 large officers stepped into the foyer. They did not look like friendly neighborhood patrolmen stopping by for a casual chat. They moved with the sharp, coordinated precision of federal agents arriving to secure a highly volatile crime scene. Their dark uniforms stood out sharply against the pristine white marble floors and the extravagant floral arrangements my mother had purchased with stolen money. The lead detective was a tall man with a stern face and absolutely zero interest in elite etiquette. He completely ignored Brenda and her desperate attempts to charm him. His sharp eyes scanned the massive living room, sweeping past the terrified socialites and the abandoned champagne flutes until they locked directly onto my brother-in-law. Todd was still slumped against the massive stone fireplace, looking like a man who had just watched his own ghost walk into the room. The lead detective marched straight toward him, pulling a folded document from his dark jacket pocket. The wealthy crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path for the officers, as if Todd had suddenly become highly radioactive. No one wanted to be standing near the blast zone when the final explosion occurred. Todd tried to push himself up from the fireplace mantel, but his legs completely refused to support his weight. He swayed awkwardly, gripping the edge of the cold stone, just to keep himself from collapsing entirely onto the hardwood floor. The charismatic, fast-talking consultant, who had spent years treating me like dirt, was completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated fear. The detective addressed Todd directly, with his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the silent room. He stated clearly that they had a federal warrant for his arrest. He listed the charges loud enough for every single guest to hear. Todd was being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, criminal embezzlement, and the forgery of legal documents in a state probate court. The words landed like heavy physical blows across the room. The elite country club guests audibly gasped in sheer horror. A prominent local politician who had just been laughing with Todd practically ran toward the kitchen to escape the toxic room. I watched Richard Caldwell offer me a small, silent nod of approval. His elite corporate attorneys had done exactly what they promised. They had taken my forensic audit and handed it directly to the federal authorities. Todd slowly raised his hands as 2 officers stepped forward and firmly grabbed his arms. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the grand living room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of 28 years of manipulation and emotional abuse finally coming to a permanent end. Todd did not fight them. He did not yell or demand to call his expensive corporate lawyers. He simply let his head drop to his chest, utterly defeated by the crushing weight of his own profound arrogance. The man who had spent years mocking my accounting degree was now being escorted out of my childhood home in complete disgrace exactly because of the numbers I had carefully audited. Chloe finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She let out a horrific, ear-piercing scream that shattered the remaining tension in the room. She shrieked her husband's name and lunged forward with her hands reaching out wildly. She cried out that they could not take him because he was a highly successful business consultant who made millions of dollars. One of the officers stepped smoothly into her path, holding up a stern hand to keep her back. Chloe stumbled backward, her expensive silk dress tangling around her legs. She looked around the massive room, begging her wealthy friends for support, and begging someone to intervene to save her perfect, privileged life. But her friends just stared back at her with cold, judgmental eyes. They saw her not as a high society peer, but as the pathetic wife of a convicted thief. Her social standing was officially dead. Brenda was leaning heavily against the grand staircase, clutching her chest as she watched the police march Todd toward the front doors. She could not catch her breath. Her meticulously constructed world of false wealth and stolen prestige was crumbling into absolute dust. She had invited 60 people to witness her grand victory, and instead she had given them front row seats to the complete criminal destruction of her family. The irony was so poetic, it felt like a beautifully written script. I stood near the dining room watching the flashing red and blue lights paint my mother face in alternating shades of panic and despair. She had called me a vicious liar just minutes ago, but the steel handcuffs on Todd's wrists told the undeniable truth. The beautiful sunny morning felt entirely new as the police cruisers finally drove away with their sirens blaring, leaving the guilty behind to face their absolute ruin. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the departing police officers, leaving a hollow vacuum in the grand foyer. The flashing red and blue lights faded down the long driveway, taking the remnants of my sister and her criminal husband with them. The sprawling living room that had been buzzing with arrogant laughter just an hour ago now felt exactly like a pristine tomb. The catered champagne was growing warm in abandoned crystal flutes, and the towering floral arrangements suddenly looked like tragic funeral displays. Chloe was huddled in a far corner of the patio, weeping uncontrollably into her hands, unable to process the destruction of her carefully curated existence. But my focus remained entirely on the woman collapsed on the bottom step of the mahogany staircase. Brenda was staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor, her chest heaving irregularly, as she struggled to comprehend how her magnificent master plan had disintegrated so completely. She looked incredibly small and defeated. The terrifying matriarch who had ruled my entire childhood with an iron fist had been reduced to a shivering and pathetic shadow. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs, before I took a deliberate step toward her. I walked across the room until the toes of my practical shoes were just inches from the hem of her expensive morning dress. She did not look up at me immediately. I reached into the deep pocket of my canvas tote bag one final time. I had spent 28 years balancing the ledgers for this selfish family, keeping their careless spending hidden from the harsh light of reality. But the forensic audit I had completed over the last 48 hours had revealed a financial maneuver so incredibly arrogant, it still astounded me. "You truly believed you were invincible, Brenda," I said softly, allowing my voice to slice through the suffocating silence. "You were so absolutely certain that Todd and his forged trust addendum would clear the probate courts by Monday morning, that you took a massive and fatal gamble. You did not just plan to spend my father and his money. You had already spent it." Brenda flinched visibly, but kept her watery eyes glued to the floorboards. "I know about the massive bridge loan." I continued, my words falling heavy and absolute in the quiet room. "I know you went to a private lender last week and used the deed to this estate as collateral." She finally raised her head. Her face was a mask of pure white terror. The vibrant color had drained completely from her cheeks, leaving her looking frail and ancient. "You borrowed $1.5 million against a house that was already heavily mortgaged," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "You used a fraudulent probate claim as proof of incoming funds to secure that massive short-term loan. You needed that immediate cash to fund this lavish party, to pay the exorbitant retainers for your country club lawyers, and to keep up the brilliant illusion of your immense wealth. But short-term bridge loans come with incredibly strict contingencies. They require immediate repayment the moment the anticipated funds fail to clear. And since a federal judge just permanently froze that commercial trust, those funds are never coming. The lender received the court injunction 30 minutes ago. They know the probate documents you submitted were entirely forged. You committed massive financial fraud, Brenda, and the bank immediately initiated the aggressive foreclosure protocol on this entire property. You do not have a single dime to your name to stop them." I slowly pulled a crisp white envelope from my bag and held it out toward her. Her trembling hands instinctively recoiled, as if the paper was burning hot. I simply let the envelope slip from my fingers, allowing it to flutter down and land directly on her lap. "That is a formal 30-day eviction notice," I stated calmly, watching her eyes widen in absolute horror. "The bank has officially seized the property. You have exactly 1 month to pack whatever meager belongings are not currently tied up in the federal fraud investigation and vacate these premises permanently. The luxury cars parked in the driveway, the imported furniture, the expensive art covering these walls. It all belongs to the creditors now. You gambled the very roof over your head on a malicious lie, and you lost absolutely everything." The harsh reality of her bleak situation finally breached the thick walls of her denial. Brenda let out a guttural, devastating sob that echoed harshly against the high ceilings. She grabbed the white envelope with shaking fingers, clutching it tightly to her chest, as if she could somehow absorb the crushing blow. "Sarah, please," she wept, sliding off the step and landing heavily on her knees in front of me. She reached out and grabbed the fabric of my coat, her fingers digging in with sheer desperation. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot let them throw me out into the street. We are family, Sarah. We are your own flesh and blood. You have all that money now. You have the billionaire connections. You have to save me. Please have some mercy on your own mother." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. For 28 years, I had desperately craved her genuine affection. I had shrunk myself down and accepted a lifetime of emotional neglect, just hoping she would one day treat me like a real daughter. But the hollow ache in my chest was completely gone now, replaced by a tranquil and absolute peace. I gently pried her clutching fingers off my coat. "You left me on the cold floor of an airport with absolutely nothing," I said, my voice steady and completely empty of any sympathy. "You stopped being my family the moment you treated me like collateral damage." I turned and walked out the front doors into the bright sunlight, never looking back. The crisp autumn wind blew through the open windows of my downtown corner office, carrying the faint, energetic sounds of city traffic high above the bustling Seattle streets. 6 full months had passed since that chaotic Sunday morning, when the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers completely shattered the grand illusion of my toxic family estate. 6 months had incredibly flown by since I walked down that long, curving driveway, leaving behind a stifling lifetime of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and severe emotional neglect. The air in my brand new world smelled like expensive roasted coffee and freshly printed legal paperwork. I was no longer the invisible suburban bookkeeper working unpaid midnight hours in the shadowy background to fix their endless mistakes. I sat proudly behind a massive polished oak desk as the official and uncontested head of the Arthur Caldwell Commercial Trust. The $4 million my quiet, unassuming father had secretly accumulated was now securely under my absolute and unyielding control. Richard Caldwell had proven to be exactly the kind of fierce corporate mentor my father always knew I needed. He did not treat me like a fragile, grieving daughter who needed to be shielded from the harsh realities of business. He treated me like a brilliant financial analyst who had successfully dismantled a highly complex embezzlement scheme over a single sleepless weekend. We worked together daily, managing a sprawling and lucrative portfolio of commercial real estate investments that spanned the entire Pacific Northwest. But the money was never just about accumulating personal wealth or acquiring mindless luxury. My father wanted me to have the ultimate freedom to dictate my own destiny, and I fully intended to share that exact privilege with those who desperately needed it. With Richard offering his vast corporate resources and heavy legal backing, I established a massive financial literacy and independence foundation. We explicitly targeted women who were trapped in vicious cycles of domestic and financial abuse. My dedicated team provided them with the aggressive legal resources, emergency housing grants, and elite accounting education they needed to safely escape their incredibly toxic environments. We taught them how to track hidden assets, rebuild ruined credit scores, and secure their own bank accounts. Every single time I handed a fresh graduation certificate to a survivor who had finally reclaimed her personal independence, I felt my father smiling down at me. I was turning the profound pain of my past into a powerful weapon for genuine good. Meanwhile, the brutal wheels of the federal justice system were grinding forward. The courts move incredibly slowly, but federal wire fraud prosecutors are relentlessly and terrifyingly thorough. Todd was currently residing in a high-security federal holding facility in Tacoma, completely stripped of his custom-tailored silk suits and his arrogant silver-tongued charm. He had been explicitly denied bail by a very unsympathetic judge due to the extreme flight risk associated with his various offshore dummy accounts. His highly publicized criminal trial was scheduled to begin in less than 3 weeks. The elite corporate defense attorneys he had desperately tried to hire demanded a massive upfront cash retainer that he obviously could not afford. He was completely relying on an overworked public defender to fight a towering mountain of undeniable forensic evidence. My detailed audit of his fake consulting firm had laid out a pristine, undeniable map of his illegal gambling debts and his systematic thievery of elderly clients. He was facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He would spend every single day of that bleak sentence knowing a boring, invisible number cruncher put him securely behind bars. The absolute devastation of Brenda and Chloe was far less legal, but entirely social and profoundly humiliating. The aggressive shadow banks had ruthlessly executed the immediate foreclosure on the sprawling suburban estate. They were given exactly 30 days to vacate the premises, but the sheer magnitude of their public disgrace forced them out much faster. The elite country club friends who had eagerly consumed their catered caviar and celebrated their fake inheritance now aggressively pretended they did not even exist. Brenda was officially blacklisted from every single charity gala, luxury boutique, and high society luncheon in the greater Seattle area. The arrogant mother and daughter duo, who had spent their entire privileged lives treating everyone else like disposable peasants, were now crammed together into a tiny, dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment located directly above a remarkably noisy commercial laundromat. The harsh reality of genuine manual labor had hit them both with a brutal and unforgiving force. Chloe, who had once bragged endlessly about her extensive designer shoe collection to anyone who would listen, was now working 40 exhausting hours a week as a junior sales associate at a discount retail store in a rapidly dying suburban mall. She spent her long, miserable days folding cheap polyester sweaters and scanning red clearance tags for the exact same wealthy women who used to attend her lavish catered garden parties. Those women made sure to look right through her. Brenda had suffered an even more poetic and completely satisfying downfall. The terrifying matriarch who had constantly mocked my father and his practical, sensible clothes was currently employed as a front desk receptionist at a local budget fitness center. She was forced to wear a cheap polyester uniform shirt, answer, ringing telephones, and hand out damp towels to sweaty strangers for federal minimum wage. They had absolutely no secret trust fund to drain and no wealthy, passive patriarch to easily manipulate. They were entirely dependent on their own meager weekly paychecks just to keep the flickering lights on in their miserable, cramped apartment. I had not spoken a single word to either of them since the morning I handed Brenda that crisp white eviction notice. They had tried to call from blocked cell phone numbers a few times during the first difficult month, leaving hysterical weeping voicemails begging for a small financial loan to help them get back on their feet. I simply deleted the dramatic messages without listening past the first 10 seconds. I owed them absolutely nothing. I was far too busy building an empire of genuine substance to waste another ounce of energy on people who only understood the parasitic mechanics of greed. My father had left me a profound legacy of quiet brilliance and unshakable resilience. The heavy chains of my toxic childhood were permanently broken, and I was finally living the beautiful, completely unburdened life he had always wanted me to experience. As I sit here today looking out over the bright Seattle skyline, from my quiet office window, I find myself thinking not about the money or the legal victories, but about the incredible weight of the invisible chains I finally managed to break. For 28 years, I lived my entire life under the heavy, suffocating delusion that if I just worked a little harder, gave a little more, and asked for absolutely nothing in return, I would eventually earn my rightful place in my own family. I truly thought my relentless loyalty would magically transform their deep indifference into genuine love. I honestly believed that shrinking myself down to fit into their tiny, distorted version of who I was supposed to be was somehow a noble sacrifice. But here is the profound and brutal truth I learned through all of those sleepless nights and endless audit spreadsheets. Staying loyal to people who only view you as a convenient obstacle or a human ATM is not an act of love. It is an act of pure self-destruction. Brenda and Chloe did not love me. They loved what I could do for them. They loved my quiet compliance. They loved that I was willing to fix their terrible mistakes, sweep their ugly secrets under the rug, and accept their casual cruelty without ever raising my voice in protest. They weaponized the concept of family to keep me trapped in a cycle of endless obligation. They used the words daughter and sister not as terms of endearment, but as heavy iron shackles designed to keep me completely subservient to their endless greed. Society places such an enormous and heavy burden on us to forgive our relatives, no matter what terrible things they do. We are constantly told that blood is thicker than water, and that family is absolutely everything. We are conditioned from a very young age to believe that walking away makes us the villain of the story. For a very long time, that intense manufactured guilt kept me anchored to a life that was slowly destroying my soul. Every single time my mother mocked my career or my sister treated me like an unpaid servant, I simply swallowed the bitter hurt and told myself to be the bigger person. I convinced myself that keeping the fragile peace was far more important than protecting my own heart. But peace built entirely on your own silent suffering is not peace at all. It is just a hostage situation wrapped in a polite suburban bow. True family is not determined by a shared last name or a matching set of DNA. True family is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine support, and unwavering honesty. It is about the people who celebrate your victories instead of tearing them down. It is about the people who stand by you when the dark storms come, rather than the ones who happily throw you out into the freezing rain. Richard Caldwell and the amazing team I work with today have shown me more authentic respect and kindness in 6 short months than my biological mother managed to show me in almost 3 decades. Healing from that level of deep systemic family abuse is not a simple linear journey. There are still quiet mornings when I wake up and instinctively brace myself for a harsh criticism that is no longer coming. There are brief, fleeting moments when I see a mother and daughter laughing together at a coffee shop, and a tiny, sharp pang of grief hits my chest for the loving relationship I was never allowed to have. But that grief no longer consumes me. It simply serves as a quiet, solemn reminder of exactly why I had to leave. I had to let go of the fantasy of the family I desperately wanted, so I could finally embrace the beautiful reality of the life I actually deserved. You cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that made you sick in the first place. You have to be willing to step out into the terrifying unknown and trust that you are strong enough to build your own safe sanctuary. I know that some of you listening to my story right now are carrying that exact same heavy burden. I know exactly how deeply it hurts to look at the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally and realize that they only see you as a tool to be used and swiftly discarded. I know the agonizing, sleepless nights spent wondering if you are simply being too sensitive or too dramatic because toxic people are incredibly skilled at making you doubt your own reality. They will happily burn your entire world to the ground and then loudly play the victim when you finally refuse to hand them another match. But you absolutely do not have to hand them that match ever again. Setting firm, unyielding boundaries is not an act of malice or bitter revenge. It is an act of fundamental survival. You have every right to protect your peace, your future, and your sanity from anyone who tries to drain you dry. It does not matter if that person is a friend, a spouse, or the mother who raised you. Walking away from an environment that fundamentally diminishes your worth is the single bravest thing you can ever do for yourself. When you finally take that brave step, you will discover something truly miraculous. You will find that the world is incredibly wide and full of wonderful people who will value you exactly as you are. You will find your true, chosen family. These are the people who will never ask you to shrink yourself down to make them feel larger. They will never view your success as a threat to their own fragile ego. They will sit at your table and share in your abundant joy without secretly plotting to steal from you. It took losing everything I thought I was supposed to want to finally gain everything I actually needed. My father gave me the financial tools, but I was the one who had to build the house. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family to protect your own future, you are not alone. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me what time it is and where you are watching from. Remember, you deserve to be chosen. See you in the next story.